Welcome to the Free Cities podcast. My name is Timothy Allen, and this is the official podcast of the Free Cities Foundation. Hello and welcome to episode number 99 of the Free Cities podcast. Well, good morning to you all, good day or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Episode 99, hey. It's amazing to think that we've recorded nearly 100 shows. I was delving around in the Spotify statistics just now, trying to work out how many hours of conversation that actually was. But unfortunately, it's not a stat that they offer. So I'm just going to make an educated guess. Looking through the episodes, I reckon they average about 1.5 hours per episode or thereabouts. So that's 148.5 hours, which is 6.18 days or 18.5 working days, if that's a 9 to 5. Yes. I really have just sat down for 3.7 working weeks, talking continuously all day. Why not? Or I could just round it up to 4 weeks. That's amazing. 1 month of continuous speaking during office hours. To be honest, that's my dream job, and I'm really here for it. I love it. Anyway, back to today's show, and it's 3 hours long, so it should be good for my batting average. I'm speaking with a gentleman by the name of Dr. David Bovill. David is a former medical scientist, hacker, programmer, artist in his past, currently known as, and I'll quote his brief bio here on the current Futurestate Congress website that he's speaking at. It says, Liquid Democracy OG, Ethereum early adopter, Commons platforms like WikiWiki contributor. If you understand that. Basically, as you'll hear here, and this was my interpretation, he's been involved in a fair few projects, but most interesting for us, the network state end of the Free Cities spectrum. So it's obviously a lot of unfamiliar territory for me. In this conversation, we talk about privacy, identity, grassroots action, digital utopias, intentional communities, nomadic communities, regenerative cities, and open source law, to name but a few. I also learn a new word too. Love my new words. Anarchive, which stems from the word anarchy, of course. I really like that one. Now, in this conversation, although we share much in common, we also disagree on a fair bit. So hopefully this will be an interesting discussion for you as a fly on our wall. I found it to be fascinating and very invigorating. So listen on for more. Don't forget, Liberty in Our Lifetime is just a few weeks away now. Get your tickets ASAP, because you know you're going to get FOMO when everyone starts posting images from the event on social media. libertyinourlifetime.org is obviously the place to get those tickets. Nostra comments from last week's show. Thanks to a non-user. There's lots of anons on Nostra. And he/she, don't know who, says, great episode. Agree that you haven't found the right church yet. Talking, of course, about my continued bemusement with Christian doctrine. If you didn't hear the show, go and take a listen. Also, an anon, bring on the next dystopia. That was written reference to something that Self-Bank was talking about, acceleration theory. And Nathan Day, hello Nathan, says, fast becoming one of my favourite pods. Well, it's obviously my favourite pod, so thanks for acknowledging that. And I will obviously see you next week on our 100th show. Hard to believe, once again. And in the meantime, of course, all you have to do is navigate to your favourite comfortable chair, recline, sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Dr. David Bovill. know.
Pretty town, that's what it means.
Bovill.
Bovill.
Bovill. Oh, Bovill, of course.
It's Norman. Yeah.
Right, okay. Gosh. Yes, David Bovill. Quick, who are you?
Well, I mean, I come from a tradition of being off-grid, I guess. It's kind of the Berlin style, never get your photograph taken online, against social media, very heavily into privacy, kind of hacker scene. Yeah, I was basically brought up and trained a scientist. So I went to medical school. I spent 10 years doing kind of biochemical, immunological research is what I was going to go into. Yeah, I wear a few hats. So since the 90s, I've been basically a hacker and a programmer. I've been an artist for 10 years as well, working in kind of theatre, installation, always collaborative work. So, yeah, I mean, I left medicine in about 93. I spent 3 years starting this thing called the Multimedia Authoring Centre in a hospital in London, all about how students could collaborate and share their notes. It was a kind of medical wiki, basically, and couldn't get funding for that. I was living in London, working with design students, teaching them the technology. It's kind of DIY, slightly pre-internet era. And then got a lot of interest for applying those same ideas to theatre. I was doing a lot of kind of parties, underground parties. It was the beginning of the warehouse scene in London. And I took the technology, the video projection, the sound mixing, the multimedia stuff, and the participatory collaboratory practice into theatre. So I got, some sponsorship from Apple, Silicon Graphics, those sorts of people. Got an office in Soho. Did some things, in that kind of art space. Basically, for about 10 years, it was the main place that I could get funding to look at areas of governance, law, participation, engagement, and changing the financial system, changing the democratic system. It was a space that allowed you to explore that. Got heavily involved in open source, Linux, and what have you. And increasingly, as I started working in that space, I got more and more involved in the kind of hacker crypto scene. So I started to work when PGP came out with kind of currencies, digital currencies, and started something with a couple of other people called Liquid Democracy. Took that around Europe, talking about that for a number of years. Kind of went off the radar for about 4 or 5 years and then got taken up by the Pirate Party, which was kind of interesting.
Uh-huh.
And then when basically, because we were following, because friends in our circle, we were working with, like I said, community currencies, cryptocurrencies, e-gold, and I knew Ian Grigg pretty well back then. Took him out to Vienna for a year. We worked with the Quintessence, a hacker collective in Vienna. Did this data mining, the NSA project there. And so when Bitcoin came out, interested in that, not especially the monetary theory behind it, but certainly the technology. And then when Ethereum came out, I was, with the white paper, I was all over it because that was the language that I could, because I'd moved more over to legal tech then. So smart contracts, and it was the kind of language that I could do, democratic, different sorts of digital institution. That's what I was really interested in. So I kind of 2014, when the first sort of hacks on the Ethereum chain 6 months before the first ICO, I was working on that. In fact, wanted to make a documentary about the evolution of the community there, and met some really interesting people at the beginning of that scene. And yeah, that eventually that path brought together with the kind of network state ideas, because that's always what we were working on in terms of crypto law and social practice, was basically reimagining the way that humans come together to make decisions at whatever scale. So I did like 3 different art projects on kind of digital utopias of one sort or another. And so I've got super interested in the network state. And together with, in that journey, I mainly hung out with kind of my Eastern European brethren. And they're the main driving force behind most of these movements. And spent some time in Belarus. I work a lot with the kind of Ukrainian diaspora as well. And so I came together with my colleague Ray about 2 years ago now, originally in Lisbon, to start Futurestate, futurestate.tv. And we're going to be doing our 3rd event now in October, the Futurestate Congress, to launch a fellowship program. So, yeah.
That's 20 hours of Googling in like 1-2 minutes or whatever. That's interesting that you kind of, you're such a tech guy, but there's not a huge amount of information about you online. Obviously, I understand the theory that it's, you don't want it out there, but also, I mean, are you a bit less concerned these days? I mean, if you're promoting things, if you're speaking publicly, you've got to appear online, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, it was quite a deep psychological thing. So I really, even on a personal level, I hated photographs or videos or sound recordings. And that was kind of an excuse, or backed up. I mean, it's just basically being shy, but driven to do things. So you have to get out there. And probably about 6-8 years ago, I can't remember, I just said, this is stupid. I mean, what you got to be shy about? Don't care so much anymore. But that's really the reason. And I mean, it is important. Privacy is super important in this space. And a lot of what seems to go wrong is the kind of incentives around attention, the kind of the way that finance and money is like, I mean, you introduced it by saying, we had a bit of a joke, didn't we, about truth? It's not got a lot of market value at the moment. So that whole speaking the truth, in fact, the foundation of democracy, anonymous voting, is a really important factor, even though some people think that, votes should be public. You should put your personality behind your votes, because that's the only authentic position. But I know from practice that if you really want the truth, you've got to have not a conversation on a podcast, if you like, but a personal one-on-one, get down to what's really behind the person and the motives and so forth. That's where you really find truth. So
I'm with you on the privacy thing, and it took me ages to reveal myself online. And I think in my case, I'm pretty shy originally. I kind of like just blasted through life. I don't really care anymore. But I do worry about what I say that gets stored forever. And for a number of reasons. One is I started realizing that I wasn't always telling the truth. Not in a malicious way. I was just getting facts wrong, saying things wrong. You realize that you heard something 10 years ago and you've been thinking it for 10 years. And actually, originally, it wasn't actually true. Simple things like a lot of ideas, even political ideas, things like that you just picked up at a young age and never challenged. And what I don't like about the modern age is that people will always try and hold everything against you. And I mean, the way to describe it is to literally take things out of context. What I said 20 years ago, or go back further, when I was in my 20s, I probably spoke complete crap. Fortunately, there was no online there. But really, you could drag up anything from my past and say, look, why would you bother listening to this guy now? Look, he believes this, or even he used to believe this, is a derogatory thing. Which is really wrong, because error correction is the whole, is the way we move through life, isn't it? I mean, it's a process of things like that. But so, yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you on on the privacy thing. What about actual privacy then? As in, you're pretty deep into those ideas, I would imagine. What's the general sense of privacy tools, ways to keep yourself secure, and what's the latest thing on your radar? Things like that.
Well, for a long time, I've definitely held the strong belief that probably the most important battle, the most important foundation for future society, future governance is identity and getting that right. Luckily and interestingly, we've got a whole range of technologies now that can create types of identity that have never been possible before. And I see identity as fundamentally political. It's kind of the atom of political being. It's your legal person, right? And the relationship between your kind of biological being and your legal person is at the root of all governance, right? So, zero knowledge proofs, self-sovereign identity, soul-bound tokens, all that good shit is super important and almost unknown in the wider polis, if you like, in the wider public. Obviously, it's kind of cool, trendy thing amongst kind of crypto people. But even then, I don't think they take it seriously enough. And that's largely because there's not really a very good business model around identity, kind of thankfully, in many ways, right? But it is the foundation of everything. It allows you to keep what you want secret and reveal it how and when you want in super interesting ways. So it's the foundation of a whole new form of freedom of expression, of media, of business transactions, of democracy. It's really, really important. And in a practical way, we're interested in kind of growing the future state based on the best form of identity we can get, which combines both the kind of human and social onboarding of people, where we encourage people to reveal, if you like, in much more detail their CV, their strengths and weaknesses, in order to forge the right kind of self-sovereign identity, in which parts of their identity are, securely encrypted in a way that both legally and technically, so that they can really trust how to reveal that aspect of themselves. And then we can explore ways with them of how to reveal and match people to projects and other teams to make sure that the right kind of diversity, neurodiversity, skill diversity of the teams is much stronger. So that has a huge benefit in terms of both innovation as well as just governance in general. And if we can kind of unlock that thing that people don't want to talk about in a way to get better collective decision making, I think that's one of the secret sources that we're interested in playfully exploring now.
Are you a fan or not of Noster?
Yeah.
That's my go-to at the moment, and the identity stuff's been built out right now by friends of ours.
Yeah,
and but I don't really do the kind of crypto thing. I've never had any interest in that side of the spectrum, and I think Bitcoin and Noster are very much connected. I'm sure there's interesting actually. Here's a question for you on the kind of crypto side. Are people who are sort of tying identity to blockchains, are they worried about censorship? Because as far as I can tell, after 10 years or whatever in the space, none of the other cryptos that I know of are actually really decentralized. There's always an attack point, a person, a node or a big node or something like that. What's your view on that?
Just about any technology, any biological knowledge, economic, process tends towards centralization. The forces that drive evolving networks towards centralization are incredibly powerful. So as hard as the original designers of a decentralized system try, they're constantly up against it in terms of how to avoid centralization. It's you see it in markets, you see it in biological species, you see it in life, full stop. And the study, I think, of ecosystems, natural ecosystems, is fundamental to being able to design properly decentralized systems. And unfortunately, the brains, if you like, or the neurotypical personalities that have the skill set and interest to deep dive into cryptoeconomics are not particularly attracted to kind of biological or evolutionary type systems. They're mathematical minds, basically. And that tends to kind of a single source of truth, this singularity, this kind of way of thinking. And they don't properly appreciate, I think they increasingly do, if you like, the sorts of epistemic barriers, the ecological niches you need to create, the inefficiencies you need in order to preserve diversity. So they seek for protocols and algorithms which universally protect them. And it's very important work and very interesting work, and it's some of the tools that we can use, but it isn't enough. So you've got to combine those mechanisms with the kind of biological, social diversity sort of mechanisms, the philosophical theories of how you constitute assemblies of human and non-human actors. You've got to think a bit wider in terms of governance and law, and you can't get all the way with pure algorithmic solutions. That's my belief.
I just going back to something you said earlier, because I think it's probably of interest. You were talking about you're involved in the party scene, right? Yeah, me too. How old are you, by the way?
61.
Oh, right, I'm 52. Yeah, I went out to Ibiza on a lad's holiday when I was 17 in 1986. Came back, we were going to Villiers Street in London, Shum and everything. Yeah. But then what happened for me, because this was the interesting, this is why I wanted to mention it. Like dance music opened my eyes to a lot of things, but the strange one was resistance culture, and it was that was new to me at that time. I'd lived a very simple life, grew up in middle class Kent, nice mum and dad, everything was cool. And then by dipping our toes into sort of, firstly it was like Balearic music, then when we came back to London, it was dance music, and then it turned into like warehouse parties, and then we started meeting all these strange people. And that was really interesting. And then things like Reclaim the Streets, the criminal justice bill, suddenly turned that whole movement for me into a kind of resistance movement. I take it that's your experience as well, right? Well, not coming into it necessarily, but
it started a bit earlier. So it started with kind of London punk, then Glastonbury, and before the walls came up, and the kind of anarchist communities and the squatting communities in London at that time. So I was a student. I had to figure out some way to live. So I'd saved money by squatting, or as I used to call it, preserving government property, because all the places that weren't squatted just fell apart. And and then the warehouse party scene and acid house and that whole shum sort of thing came along, and there was a really good period of kind of self-organized warehouse parties, and those communities came together at that point.
Yes, but what obviously now looking back in hindsight was slightly depressing about it was I remember that feeling in 87, 88 of, oh my God, this is incredible. And actually, it was the first subculture I'd ever been involved in. And thinking about it, until Bitcoin, which was a long time later, it was the only subculture I ever really thought was new and innovative and amazing. And, you know, I found a lot of the same experiences when I sort of started finding out about Bitcoin later. I was already having a completely different life. But what was depressing looking back was how quickly that movement was quashed. And, you know, within a few years, the criminal justice bill came in. You couldn't amass more than 3 people together in one room. Wasn't it something ridiculous like that, wasn't it? You know, and it's pretty disheartening when you think about it.
Because it's worse than that. It's a repeating pattern.
Yes.
I mean, it's the same as the Arab Spring. It's the same as what happened in Russia, if you like, when the Berlin Wall came down. It just repeats. It's like, you know, I'm pretty sure it was the same in the French Revolution, right? There's this repeating pattern of some super smart, really well-intentioned people coming together, having their moment in the sun, getting a kind of mass support behind it, and then an utter lack of structure, which lets the gangsters move in, lets the forces that are interested in power come, and they have zero defense against them. So for the warehouse scene, it was basically, it got taken over by drug dealers who kind of could organize and finance the bar and get the venues, and they kind of outcompeted, if you like, the people who were just putting on the parties for fun, and scared them away as well. So it was
physically scared them away, and really, the heavies came in and said, "We run this now." I remember the situations like that. I remember going to my first warehouse party that wasn't run by interesting people, and realizing, Jesus, this is different. This is very different.
By the way, from a personal point of view, it's one of the main motivations for us in Futurestate in terms of looking at the network state. So the idea is that, you know, at any level, but the world seriously needs a kind of emergency digital infrastructure, which has been designed and tested and worked out well in advance, that can, in a situation of a failed state or city or bottom-up organization, bottom-up movement, you can kind of drop that digital infrastructure in place, and then that community can evolve and design it and shape it to their own ends from the local provable basis of who that community is, right? So, you know, I do think quite a lot. I was kind of on Twitter before the Arab Spring, and at the Arab Spring. After that, I went off Twitter. But you could see that movement, and I could just feel it falling apart, you know, and saying, "Oh shit, it's happening again," kind of thing, right? And you just want, you know, a kind of a way of preventing that process, not kind of freezing it, but allowing it to evolve healthily, because, you know. Yeah, that's really one of the key kind of research topics is of the next year for me, is to get the best minds that we can attract to a fellowship to work on that emergency state digital infrastructure, particularly looking at the sort of problems that we can imagine happening when a lot of finance goes into somewhere like Ukraine to rebuild it. So that's the sort of thing that happened in Iraq and what have you. There's a lot of money to be made, a lot of big companies, construction companies. And it's classic that in that state, the people on the ground who might have dreams about the future of their country have very little say. So I firmly believe we have enough time to work with on-the-ground communities to because that's something I don't like about the kind of crypto. I mean, it's not that I don't like, it's understandable, but it's a little bit kind of virtual. It's not grounded working with real communities enough. It's not grounded. It's finance and idea driven rather than being iteratively tested on the ground, if you like. So one of the things about the fellowship that we're starting, we've been working on it for 2 years now, but is to work with people who are working with communities that are demanding something that requires network state infrastructure. Not that just like the politics of it or are interested in the idea philosophically or technically, but really need it. And then iterating with them to help design and choosing the right technologies for that. That's kind of my science side, that kind of iterative experiment on the ground, rather than coming in with your architecture, your chain, your system, and then say, who wants that?
I'm with you on the excuse me. I'm with you on the lack of grounding of a lot of people on that side of the spectrum. I've to the point where I don't really want to hear too many more ideas. Really, there's a lot of ideas out there, and I'm not that interested really. I think we know what the task is. We don't necessarily need to overthink it just yet. Let's get stage one done first. But going back to what you said about this kind of repeating cycle of, innovation or new ideas, these movements that start and then get quashed. Is it any different now? Has the internet changed things? A lot of people that I speak to seem to think that we actually do have a brand new opportunity now, which is never before seen, in a lot of senses. And then when you really drill down on that, at the core of it is the digital realm. It was, it's only been around for 50 years or whatever. It was no one could ever step foot in that place until now, throughout the history of humanity. So do you think that's true, or do you think we're doomed to sort of keep going through these cycles again? Because interestingly, what's happened in the digital realm as well is exactly the same thing. It started off as a free-for-all frontier where all this stuff was happening, and now it's getting regulated and gate-kept and blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, are we doomed to keep repeating this cycle over and over again?
No, we're not. No, things change, things evolve. The dinosaurs aren't with us anymore. But it's not digital. Digital's like a foundation. It was a revolution. The internet was a revolution. It was kind of, I saw it coming. I remember the whole thing about it coming, and I remember showing it to people saying, this is going to change everything kind of thing. And they're looking at it and saying, what are you talking about? These would be professors, lawyers, investors, students. It's like, and it's often the case, I think, with revolutions. It shows this. They have strange properties that they're quirky, delicate, vulnerable. And somehow they kind of flourish, reproduce, and take over the world. Whether it be democracy is another kind of example, or the idea of even money is absurd. Like if you imagine trying to start it in the age of swords and kings, and hey, take this little token, play with it, and trust me on that, and that's not going to work. And then eventually, somehow, with a bit of power backing and infrastructure, it takes off in some place. Or we've got this Persian army invading us. We'll make our decision based on putting these little tokens in a bucket in a theatre, and that's really a sensible way to sort of like structure our society and defend our kingdom or what have you. But it's not just digital. The internet was a revolution, but it was effectively a knowledge or a revolution, or as I like to call it, a revolution in gossip. It just reduced the cost of moving information bits from one part of the planet to another to near zero, and that allowed you to publish whatever bit of gossip you wanted, right? But it had no infrastructure for provable stuff. It had no legal basis to it, right? So, whose image of a cat was that, and it took ages for him to kind of hack into the ability to pay for things, right? And then the whole business model is based on advertising, which is basically a business model for lying. As a friend of mine, an artist, used to say, it's a pollution in the kind of knowledge space. If you want to, if you want truth or knowledge, you're not going to get that when someone is trying to sell you something, right? And everything is funded by that means. So that obviously corrupts. If you combine a technology which is perfectly suited for gossip with the economic model of advertising, corruption in truth, you're going to get the problems that we've got. And then it was obvious for the last 20 years that was going to happen, right? But no one really cares, because if you want to make money or if you want to publish your thoughts, it's amazing. But the consequences of that, I cared about deeply right from the beginning, being a kind of knowledge scientist nerd. It's like, no, that's going to really fuck things up. And why I got interested in crypto is because it's not digital. It obviously uses digital, but it's basically social. It's a completely different form of being. It's like law. It interacts with the human nervous system in the same way that law does. If I call it performative, it's a performative language. In philosophical terms, it's a speech utterance that when you speak it, when you perform it, it is incredibly likely that something real is going to happen in the real world. If a general orders something, if you issue a contract, or if you say, I will offer to pay X amount to get this done, it's very likely that someone at some time is going to do that thing. And that's very different from just describing the world, which is the internet, Twitter. All of the stuff is just describing. But when you get into the world of finance, law, crypto, you're talking about a completely different form of language, which is the language of power, effectively, of social power. It's completely invented by human beings, but human beings almost worship it. They're very weird, the way they interact with these statements. And so if you really want to change the way things work, or protect things, or stop certain forms of corruption happening, that's the language you need to know and understand. And it is now being democratized. It is effectively now open source. It doesn't mean it's just code, but law has always been effectively open source. It's just kind of professionalized and expensive, but it's in many parts of the world a public utility. You can write your own contracts. You can form your own legal entities. You can script them and write them, particularly in jurisdictions where that is more expressive, where you are a lot freer in terms of writing your own agreements in partnership law and so forth, right? Rather than constitutional law, which becomes a lot more bureaucratic, if you like. But now we can do amazing things legally, and we can do amazing things technically, and we can marry those two things in even more amazing ways. And you could be a kid anywhere in the world and work on this stuff. And that it makes a serious difference in the ability, if people are so motivated, to craft new forms of governance.
So why I read that was abstract power. This kind of networks of abstract power or projected power through what, they don't exist other than in the sort of mental realm, but they are powerful, but they're an abstraction of physical power, aren't they? They make you do things.
That's what a general does. Yeah, I mean, he wears a certain uniform, silk, and so it's very, very concrete. If you get invaded by an army, or if the lawyers come and confiscate your home, and so it is. I wouldn't call it abstract power. It literally is power. It is.
Yeah, I'm thinking I suppose I'm labeling power as physical power. That's why. That's where power starts for me, is the physical. But actually, it doesn't necessarily
take you as a communist. So
what's that?
No, I mean, power isn't just material.
Sure. Yeah.
It's this interface between the mind, if you like, and the material, certainly. And the language that interfaces that is this strange thing called law.
So, according to you, then, I've written words down here. You mentioned network state infrastructure.
Yeah.
Can you talk about network state infrastructure in terms of what I was calling abstract power, but you can just call power? I mean, is that part of the point of the network state? It must be.
Yeah.
To implement a new version of that, or an innovative version.
Yeah. So, for instance, you can look at property, and you can redefine what property is. So, whether that be the way in which you own land or other intangible assets, if you like, and you can't do it maybe like in a purely weird, abstract, utopian way. You still have to deal with both the current state of the code that you have and the current state of the legal system, right? But within that, you've got a huge design space now to reinvent intellectual property, to reinvent land ownership. And so, for instance, with the pieces of land that we are working with, we're looking at, exploring the common ownership of that land and how it's parceled up. So we're looking very much at creating, based on all the elements that are kind of interesting to explore, like community land trusts, other jurisdictions, the legal personhood of nature, how you represent the future generations in the governance of that land, right? How you protect it so it can or can't be sold, and yet how you get enough freedom, and so you can separate layers of rights of usage of that land, to build your house how you want, to sell your house. But the land, for instance, you might not want sometimes to be sold, right? You want it to be held in common by the community for various reasons. You don't always want to do that, but there's a whole space there in which you've got intentional communities coming together saying, we want to come together and create a new way of living together. And that's hard. I mean, that rarely succeeds. I mean, nearly every intentional community, I don't know, it's like 80 to 90% of them fail after about 7 years, right? So it's not a naive exercise to enter into. You really got to study them. You've got to workshop them. You've got to be careful about who you on board. I mean, it's the same with kind of Zizalu and what have you. It's like the first wave, or those warehouse parties. The first wave is often really uplifting, and then these kind of corrupting forces come in and the whole vibe changes, the whole infrastructure changes, and it just becomes very hard to, pick out those gems again, if you like. So you need to build the structures in terms of onboarding people, and the kind of the way that I talk about the kind of smart contracts or the legal contracts is not an algorithm or a set of prescriptions that say what you must do. It's a way of creating a space within which you're free to interact with the people inside that space to come up with a decision that you're happy with. So it's a kind of protective wall which allows you to be buffered from certain external corrupting forces and to maybe focus on this particular area in the decision-making or choice architecture. So it's really what you want to do is start designing the governance of these spaces with a full knowledge of the history of failures of previous communities, in order to provide the freedom and the space with which to make the right decision, right, and quote, it's always going to be political in the sense of you are crafting an architecture based on a set of values that you wish to evolve or move towards.
Going back to specifically the network state, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the idea of the network state is to amass a state or a version of a state online and then sort of manifest it in real life. Is that, very broadly speaking, roughly what it is?
Yeah, I mean,
rather than build a place, then attract people. You build the community and then you build the place.
Yeah, I mean, at Futurestate, we would extend that a little bit. So, what I really like about Network State is it's moved the crypto space much more seriously towards the legal space. So when you start to have to buy land, you have to start taking law seriously and the whole variety of legal frameworks across the world, right? And you start to think, oh, that one's interesting, and you start to speak that language. And law is a lot easier than code. It's overrated in terms of its complexity. I mean, any video game is far more complicated in terms of the code than a nation state's legal code. Right? It's open source. It's difficult to get your head around, but it's not that complicated. But it has a lot of rich philosophy in it, law, much more than most software has. But that moving towards law and buying land is a really valuable move on behalf of Network State. But it's also possible with diaspora, for instance, in communities that are nomadic. So that is also a very interesting space, because nomadic communities, whether it be the Ukrainian diaspora or the Belarusian diaspora or Hong Kong diaspora or asylum seekers or digital nomads, these communities need kind of state-like provisions. And they want to be mobile, or they're forced to being mobile. They don't necessarily want to buy land, let's say, where they are right now, but they're very interested in building something solid, and possibly or definitely buying land in the future. And so that gives us a more kind of agile basis to work with those communities to craft the digital institutions which they will need when they do buy land. And the problem about focusing on buying land is the timescale by when you figure out whether you've got it right or wrong is probably about 7 years, and it probably takes you maybe 10 years to even begin to build things quite often. So you can make up your utopian schemes, and it's going to take you a third of your life to find out whether you've screwed it up or not. Well, if you work in faster cycles and test it with real communities that have some skin in the game, you've got a better chance of designing it well. And it is a really hard design challenge. So, that's why with the Futurestate we're starting this like annual fellowship where we're working more in creative space. So we're working in a playful digital space in where we work with those communities with real projects, but we're working with this science fiction methodology. So we have some IP from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So that's a long story, but I couldn't talk about that. And so we're basically asking people to imagine a future state, let's say in 50 years' time, to imagine the laws, to write down those laws, to imagine the code and the technology that would govern them, to govern all the future, chaos and polycrisis that's coming our way, from AI to, gene drives to human-centered conflicts to climate change, to imagine them and to, in an embodied way, workshop those, right? To see how would I react if I had this technology? Would that work? Would that not work? And then use that practice to design the governance systems and put that in a science fiction script. So that's what we're working on playfully with the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Future, which is to recruit and fund 42 fellows to go to all the Network State events, to be in the different disciplines from, smart contract to legal to architecture to history to legal philosophy and get a whole diversity of fellows working on that central question of what is the form of governance that we as a group could posit as a potential solution to these kind of challenges, to stop that repeat pattern that we talked about earlier. and to do it through the creative exercise of really imagining what that would look like and feel like to live in it, and then to feed that back in a kind of new methodology for the school, a new research methodology that needs to be iterative and fast enough. And it's difficult to explain without it being a word salad, but it's going to be fun.
It sounds to me like you're back engineering a governance model.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to describe it?
It's a very good way. I mean, in fact, technically there's this word in kind of theatre filmmaking called backcasting. So what you do is you imagine the future, where you want to go to, and then you backcast that to the present, which is kind of your documentary layer, the here and now, this is where we are. And then you have to create a series of scenes or steps that realistically take you from here to there. And that whole script, that whole kind of sci-fi classic Terminator, Back to the Future type script is one in which you can kind of scenario test the design methodology of consciously designing the governance systems that you want to build, but also giving you the kind of playfulness to sort of like hack it and sort of say, that won't work. And, it'll be attacked like this and it'll probably all go wrong. And to bring in that kind of sense of humor, that jester for governance, which is a really undervalued voice in most of politics or even technology. It's too arrogant. It's too full of itself, and it's not playful enough to really think about the dangers, the risks in quite the way that I think, particularly when you want to engage a public in that deliberation. So
you need a merry prankster in there, don't you?
Yeah, jester. I mean, that is the voice of Douglas Adams, really. It is the Hitchhiker voice. It is that sense of humour to bring it down. And it is, in fact, for me, this, the sixth pillar of governance, good governance, is to make sure, one of my business partners, a Russian lady, that's what she brought up. She said, we kept on asking people about governance for probably 20, 30 years. How would you do it? And how would you choose? Like, for instance, how do we choose 42 people to design this governance system? That's like, it's like choosing 42 people to represent all of humanity, or a particular region at least. And it's like, most people say, well, I'll just choose them. And other people talk about random stuff. And we're really, really bad at choosing a leader. I mean, the things that I think we're worst at is how we choose leaders, and then how we delegate power, and how we pass on power, how a leader passes on power. These are probably the three biggest fuck-ups that we do as human beings, right? Getting that right, doing that in a different way is really, really important. And the radical humility, as a friend of mine, Robbie, says, of both, in a way, the scientific method and that kind of stand-up comedian, that jester-like kind of attitude, is just fundamental to proper governance.
Going back to breaking the cycle then, because I can understand what you're saying, and I've been answering my own question just thinking about it, I think, but what I always come back to is in all this stuff, and it's this cycle of new ideas being quashed is a good example of this. That at the end of the day, the sort of large boot of the state coming down puts a stop to anything, really. Is your theory that if you can, in your kind of in your ideas about governance, are you including a way to mitigate that? I mean, how do you deal with the physicality of someone who's stronger than you just coming in and taking what you've got and getting, and taking it over?
It's something that comes up a lot. And I mean, when I look at it from a position of being in London and traveling around the world, it's not a big factor, quite honestly. It's like the scope for doing what I want with currencies, money, companies, law, property ownership, it's just like it rarely causes me a problem, particularly because I'm not that interested sort of in making like mega bucks, you know. That's when people really get a little bit more vicious and you've got to kind of use, you know, your proper legal defenses. I'm more interested in reinventing, redefining things. And there's so many scope for loopholes and design within that space that it doesn't come up. In other parts of the world, it's serious shit. It's like you really have to, if you want to do something democratic, if you want to do something with property or land or money, your life's in danger. So then it becomes really, really important. And luckily, the technology allows us to do both. Right. So it is entirely possible to create. I mean, for me, one way, people probably hate me for saying that, but the basis of a network state is just a multinational company. That's it. It's nothing else. It's the ability to own land anywhere in the world and figure out how to do it and have the power to do it and to have workers and transactions across nation states and get your employees visas is just basically democratizing the power of a multinational corporation in some sense, right? You know, and within that corporation, how you organize your workforce, the contracts you do, how you define property that is held in common by that corporation, you've got an incredible amount of freedom to design that how you want. Now, if you're just a single person in a single jurisdiction and starting something, that becomes, you're kind of subject to the winds of law, if you like, and finance. But within a company, these are basically fiefdoms. These are kingdoms within which you've got a huge design space. And then if you combine that with the power of crypto, to do things and automate things and do things between and internationally and do things which are secure and privacy respecting. And, you've got a very big design space. If you want to do things, let's say, to do with war zones, Belarus, if you want to do things with vulnerable communities, you can also create legal structures and privacy respecting technologies which protect and enable you to do also amazingly interesting things. There are some things you can't do, but generally speaking, when I think about them, there's not that many. I mean, okay, there are certain parts of the world where you just can't buy land, but you know, if you want to buy a huge chunk of land somewhere and turn it into a special economic zone, it's just a question of raising the money and talking to the right jurisdiction, really. You know, if you want to just take private plots of land, transfer them into some form of common ownership and organize them within a network state set of legal protocols, there's nothing stopping you doing it.
What is a network state series of protocols, for example? Give me an example. What makes them any different from, you know, well, a non-network state one or set?
Well, one, you can design them fully in code, so you can design them digitally. So, you can basically structure your legal entities and your ownership contracts purely as you would any piece of software, right? And but it's unhackable or very difficult to hack, and it's got the ability to use finance and smart contracts. And if you then make those smart contracts legally capable as well, and I'm particularly I work within this domain of legal languages. So I work with a project called Lexon, which is a constrained legal language. In other words, the code that you write looks almost indistinguishable from a contract, and therefore it is a contract. It's like if we both sign that contract, it stands up in a court of law because we can understand it.
But it's code as well.
it compiles down to, at the moment, 2 different blockchains and to JavaScript if you want, and you can extend it to any blockchain. And it's therefore it's this marriage or unification of law and code in a really interesting way, and that I believe is the future of law on this planet. Is basically open source law. It's one that you can understand, a child can understand, a community can understand. You can express it in not just English. We've done experiments writing it in kanji script, for instance. You could write it in Spanish, German, Swahili, and these, because it's got a very small vocabulary, so it might take 3 months to add a natural language to it. It's not AI, although you can use AI to help you write it. So it's completely logical language. It does what it says on the tin. It doesn't hallucinate, if you like. So, and the human-centered work of working with communities backwards and forwards allows you to run workshops and then say, is that what you mean? And they say, yeah, I think. And then you can compile it, test it out, see if it does what they say. And they say, let's change it. And you can go back and change it. And it also future-proofs that work. So let's say it takes you maybe a year working with communities to design a governance for, let's say, this city in Ukraine that we're looking at, this regenerative city in Ukraine, which, by the way, they want to call 42, which I find hilarious.
Who's they?
It's a couple. They're actually a little bit shy. Victor and Hannah, they live in Ukraine right now. Hannah's an architect. Victor is a kind of entrepreneur, business guy. And they have agreements with the council and some private developers for a large plot of land just near Kyiv, in between Kyiv and Bucha, which is notorious now, to build a substantial regenerative city. And they've been working on it for 2 years now. We're actually doing an event tonight, which Vera, one of the Free City Fellows, is going to also be speaking about. That's the Rebuild Day, or the Rebuild theme of our fellowship and the Congress we're doing, to explore that particular plot of land and the issues around the community design, the ownership of the land, the investment in that land, and how it will be legally structured and so forth. And they're quite a long way down that route. And so obviously it'll take a while, but it takes a while to plan these things and design these things. So we want to be ready for when it's possible to rebuild and reconstruct, to be able to do it from the ground up, from the Ukrainian community, designed by the community locally, and to give them, a full design space to actually structure that, and which will cost, hundreds of millions of pounds to build this city. So they've got to defend against corruption and investment and make the right decisions. What do we want to build? Do we want to build a school here, or do we want condos?
Is there any degree of autonomy in this place?
What do you mean by that?
Autonomy from Ukraine, the state of Ukraine, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, is
it like a special economic zone? Or is it?
It's not a special economic zone yet, but we can certainly.
Currently, it's just a bit of land that's.
It's about 3 parcels of land. Some of it has been. There's a kind of MOU from the local municipality saying we want to rebuild a regenerative city on this land. Some of it is private ownership, and they've done the same. I forgot what the third one is. I'm actually not an expert on that plot of land, so I'm really looking forward to today to dig into it. But basically, it is like a commercial proposition to transfer that land into some form of legal status. I don't actually know what the legal statutes around ownership are, but the idea that I would certainly suggest is you take the equivalent in Ukrainian law for a community land trust, and you put that land into the ownership of the city, and that the members of that city, that regenerative city, own that piece of land. So it's a kind of mutual structure. And then you go from there. You say, well, what the fuck does that mean? How about the people who've invested in it? Do they own it, or do they just own the buildings and so forth, right? And how can you buy and sell things? And what about you're talking about it being regenerative. What do you mean by that? Is that in the constitution in some way? How is that represented? How are decisions made about the governance of that city? And should it, and sometimes it often makes sense for it to lobby for and get special economic zone status, so that you can do things that and attract investment that are harder otherwise. But the real question is how you get the people and the community and the finance and the decision making at that city level structured in a way which is different to the same old, right? And that's what everyone's looking for. And the forces that will kind of eventually either destroy that experiment, as has happened, like I said, with most intentional communities, or just revert it back to the current matrix model, if you like, are incredibly powerful. So you've got to be really smart about how you design it, and you've got to spend a long time designing it, and you've got to workshop it with people, and you've got to get people on board. And I think a lot of the current networks, say, experiments and communities are a little bit naive about how difficult that is.
Now, my next question, which you alluded to then, was going to be, what is a regenerative city? Whose word is that, or whose term
That's
is
actually
that?
Victor's, but I mean, I've my whole life been surrounded by hippies. It's basically, I would say it has two main structural elements. So circular economy, and taking into account the environmental issues, the greening, the sustainability of energy, food, water, and coming up with a model for sustainable living on this planet. So that is the aspiration of Victor and the people on the ground, to look towards a kind of new regenerative vision of the future of Ukraine. And that's what they want to do. And that's also, I think, super relevant, important to many communities. It's not super strong in the crypto sort of space and communities, but a lot of the intentional communities, a lot of the eco-villages, a lot of the pop-up kind of DAO-based villages around the world are also experimenting with that form of co-living and co-design, and trying to embed environmental principles into how they live, and the constitution, if you like, or the legal framework of the design of that space. And so that's what Victor and Hannah want to do as well. And that's what they're seeking for support.
My observations of, I'm just thinking about a couple of projects, one, the Ukraine one, and then the other one, something like Zuzalu, which you spoke about. I went to Zuzalu, and I didn't find it very inspiring. As compared to, for example, I can imagine a project in Ukraine having legs, simply because Ukrainians share this commonality, which is very different to I didn't feel any commonality at Zuzalu, really. Not deep sort of, like you would get from, say, Ukrainian citizenship plus probably going through a lot together with the war or something like that, And I think that's one of the problems with the network state idea. And every time I kind of come in contact with it, I meet a lot of transient people. I meet a lot of people who reside in their thoughts a lot. Is that is it unfair of me to say that? As opposed to, I'm just thinking about those two projects and as soon as you mention the Ukraine one, I think, yeah, that could work. And then you say, oh, what about, you mentioned something in Costa Rica with, I don't know, and I'm like, that's not going to work. That's going to become one of the 90% that don't work,
I mean, I think you're right. And you just got to look at who was it? I'm terrible at remembering names. I'm dyslexic, but was it Henry Ford? I can't remember. One of those guys trying to build a utopian factory-based city in Central America, and it all turned to shit.
Even with the factory there, because I mean that model. I can see that really works. If you need people to live in the houses to work in the factory, that makes total sense.
Yeah,
but
it didn't. I mean, because it was transporting kind of American culture straight into the jungle somewhere, and it just, it seemed like a good idea to move there at the time. It was exciting and interesting, but in the end, all sorts of problems happen.
Sorry to butt in, but there is, I think it's Toyota City in Japan really is working. It's one of the really successful, and but I can, once again, I look at that, I think about Japanese culture, I think that's going to work,
I mean, I think as a design criteria, it's basically having enough skin in the game, really. It's really, and it's that contact with reality. It's like thinking about the whole lifestyle. You've really got to think about children, grandparents, passing it on, what happens second, third, fourth, fifth generation. And then you've got to have this definitely an economic core to it. How's it going to sustain itself? And that's both financially, but also energetically in a whole range of ways. It's the city has to sustain itself. You've got to keep, for instance, the idealism that might take you 3.5 years or something like that through a process. But how do you regenerate that feeling? You've really got to look at the history of things. You've got to be, a key skill for me is going back to the start, is being a party organizer. If you know how to refresh that party, keep it alive, keep that spirit there, it'll get stale after a while, and then reinvent it without, and bring in other creative forces, step down, go on holiday, come back again. That kind of, it's like, how do you keep that alive? Is a whole system. It's a whole governance system. And if you look at in history, if you just have one director who's founded it, then it'll die when that guy gets run over, or it'll turn into something completely different when he gets too old or she gets too old. So it needs to be a kind of group ecosystem type project, creative project to begin with. It needs to have a good business plan, and it needs to have what I'd call an energetic business plan. So you've got to, I see it a bit like designing a festival and the early stage. Get that right and you're halfway there, then really think more hard about not just owning. So like with the Hitchhiker's Guide stuff, we have this IP, it's valuable. So the owner of the IP is Don't Panic Limited, Robbie and his partner, because they knew Douglas Adams, want to transfer that IP, which they really care about, because it's very personal to their life and everything like that, the whole values of that work, right? And they want to transfer it into community ownership, mutual ownership in perpetuity. They don't want it to be sold to Google or what have you. And so that structuring to make sure that the legal governance and the rights and the to that means that the values of that original work are held by the community is much like the same if you want to create a regenerative city rather than just, a factory city or a party city. These are different sorts of cities, and how you keep that ethos and culture while not being autocratic and defining a rigid set of rules is a design process that faces anyone who runs a festival, for instance, a creative or an arts festival. How do you keep that alive? How do I find another director or curator? What's the social process? And it's also in script writing now with a lot of kind of serialized TV shows. You have a team of writers rather than one writer. It's like, how do you create these evolving structures that can last more than one lifetime of one founder is essential when you're thinking of a real city. And even with these more agile communities that we're talking about, we want to experiment with the governance around that. So, for instance, how we choose the 42 research fellows that we fundraise for. So our aim, if anyone's interested in applying, is to give each fellow a budget of 42,000 euros, probably dollars, pounds, whatever they are, right? And for them to propose their journey, their individual research journey, which that's the real question, we will curate to look at the teamwork between all 42 fellows. And they have to publish a work at the end of the year, a group work, which they will design the rules of. And that published work will literally be the constitution of the project. And we're going to do that as a science fiction script that we write about the future state. And it will be a legal constitution, and it will be in code, and it will determine how the next fellowship runs, how it's financed, how the payment works, how the money works, how the intellectual property works, and how the 42 are chosen. And the joke there is that the answer to life, the universe, and everything is 42, which is the minimum size, statistically speaking, of a citizen assembly. So we're founding it initially on the idea of creating these small micro assemblies of diverse fellows from skill sets, mind, culture, and what have you. There might be economists. What's a diverse group of 42 representative economists? Or it might be young people, or it might be Ukrainians, or it might be etc. But it's a kind of recursive algorithm, and we're using a particularly playful one, that each fellow is required to engage on the ground real communities with their vision of what it is, and then negotiate with each other to publish a vision, a collective vision of what that future constitution is, and to publish it in a way that people can experience it and understand it as a science fiction script.
The 42 thing is obviously the jester in there, because really Douglas Adams, I think he said he just made it up. There's no significance to it at all. I mean, I've heard all the theories, I think, as to why that's the answer. But he is quoted himself as saying he's just sat in his garden looking out the window and he just thought 42. Oh yeah, I'll do that.
Yeah, that's
and that
true.
was it. Yeah. You're taking it really seriously, though.
I'm taking it super seriously.
That's why I'm saying maybe it's the jester, because maybe you're really not taking it seriously. I don't know.
You have to judge, yeah.
Right.
I mean, that space between serious and not serious, which is super English, I think, right, is I think the core design space. I mean, because I have done previously in my previous non-online incarnation, like governance experiments, which went terribly wrong, right? Because it was too serious. So, I did this, there was this experiment in Vienna, where it was about how funding to the arts community happened, this Nets project. And it was amazing and fun and creative while we were designing it. But when the city decided to allocate its €5 million budget every year, instead of to the big museums and galleries, but directly to this avant-garde community, everyone started to pile in, and because they were all losing their income, it just fell apart completely. And so if you really want, if you ask, for instance, in politics, in parliament here or in Ukraine anywhere, and you say, how do we change the political system, this, that, and the other, you will just get all the power brokers in, and they are not just vicious, they're smart and they're funded, and people don't have time really to think about it, and it's extremely difficult to change the rules of the games in the system. But if it's too playful, if it's just like a movie or a book or a game that we play and an art thing, then just people come up with the funniest shit, basically. It doesn't matter. It's nothing. you have to design right in the middle, where you've got enough skin in the game to sort of care and then laugh and design and play. And then in that space, people can really seriously think and be creative about other ways of doing things. And that's the space that we want to hold with this Hitchhiker Fellowship. We want to literally design, I mean, it's a €2 million budget, so it's a significant budget to each year, right? But how that gets distributed is going to be up to the 42. But it's within this kind of playful science fiction universe, and yet it's based on real world engagement with communities that are facing real world problems, imagining the future they really would like. So in that space, I think you can, that's the conscious design space really that we need to iterate over, if we're going to have any hope of designing well tested, well thought through, and yet creatively new governance systems.
Can I ask a quick question before we move on? Who's stumping up €2 million for something like this?
Well, I can't say exactly right now, apart from we haven't fully raised that money yet. But for instance, some of it comes from the creative industries. So there's some people who, like Hitchhikers, right, who helped with the original film and what have you, and say, yeah, I like this project. I like the idea of funding a researcher. Here's 42K. Then there are, we're partnering with a very early stage at the moment negotiation with the Restate Foundation to fund a proper academic fellowship. And there are then, if you like, foundations and public donors for that as a proper research institute. And then there are things like family offices who have got various interests. And then there are the crypto projects who might want fellows to work on their particular technology and research it. So, for instance, it's the idea in general, with finance in general, if you want to finance that, is don't put all your eggs in one basket, is to have a kind of mixture of philanthropic and private funding, where you can always say no, you know. And if you can't say no to money, you're not designing it properly. You're designing it for a particular interest. So, you need to do that a little bit, but in the overall, you need to be free to say no. So, I mean, I think a test for us is how many sources of funding we reject, rather than, so far it seems pretty good in terms of people who want to fund it.
Seems like a lot. I mean, every year, 2 million a year.
Yeah.
Good luck. I mean, that seems like if you get the funding for that, that's very positive from my side of the fence. When I look at that, I think brilliant.
I mean, if you look at the amount of money that will be required to do things within, let's say, the next 5 years, to do something like reconstruct Ukraine, to manage that properly. And if you look at the sorts of legal, financial, investment, government, EU, US-based institutions that need to put in some systems and are interested and motivated to put in systems that does that more efficiently, in a new way, democratically, and the complexity of the contracts and everything involved in that, there is enough space in there to do pilots, for instance. And 2 million is a drop in the ocean for projects like that. I mean, to me, it's insane that it's not done. I mean, the biggest problem on the planet is appropriate governance of all this shit. And the amount of money we spend investing, researching, and not just in theory, but in practice. This is not about, hey, it's fun. It's like, what are those legal contracts? What is that code? Does it work? Is it efficient? Is it understandable? Can we evolve it? Is it usable by communities? The amount of work that we do on that, we need a million times the investment in that area of, we're putting small amounts into running various forms of democratic experiments, citizen assemblies and what have you, but there's no research and thought going into this. I mean, there's tiny amounts. And big up to the kind of crypto community in terms of its ability to raise finance to do weird shit in this space, right? But it's not grounded enough. So we've got an opportunity now to put those two things together as well. And so we can do proper legal research here. We can do proper coding development of tools that are investable. But we're doing it as a not-for-profit core, kind of on the MIT model, Media Labs model, which is basically supporters, investors can put that money in and then they share all the research of the 12 months fellowship. And it will all be published in a new form of research commons that we're calling the Anarchive. So getting that research institute funded, and while 2 million euros sounds a lot, it's not.
Anarchive. I've never heard that one before. That's good. I like that. I like plays on words.
That comes from actually a really good arts community called the Sphere. They spent 4 years working out a kind of DAO for the performing arts, and the kind of spin-off project from that was the Anarchive. So I said, "Can I steal that?" And I'm working. They're really good. Yeah.
Something I want to go back to, because I got sidetracked when you were talking about the pitfalls of establishing a new community, and you were saying, it's not like you've learned a lot from producing festivals, say, or for running events, festivals, this kind of stuff, party organising. It made me think that is literally half the story, and that's the easy half. Like, the easy half is to create a really exciting looking thing. The lineup for the bands, it's all potential, it's all great, it's like, and that's easy to attract people there, and we can attract people to anywhere. The hardest half of the project, and it's probably not even a half, it's probably a lot more than a half, is keeping them there. And with a festival, of course, you're expecting everyone to go after a few days. It's even easier. You want them to go, in fact. Now, historically, when you look back at cities, communities, they were never based around ideologies really much. They were always based around commerce. Yeah. So is that something you think is the way to go? How do you found a city without, the problem with, I've been to a lot of ideological communities, and the problem with ideological communities is ideologies change in people. Like when I was in my 20s, I was a hippie too. I'm in my 50s now. I'm a version of a hippie, I suppose, but I'm not really. A lot of that stuff means nothing to me now. It's like much more pragmatic, far less ideological, blah, blah, blah. And, but that can happen in really small periods of time. We went to, there's a libertarian community in Montenegro. When we went to Zuzali, we went to visit them at the same time. It's called Montelibro. And they're kind of doing that there right now. They've got their lands, they're building buildings, and good. But when I dig a little bit deeper in those projects, you discover, okay, who's actually going to stay here? Because people first thought is, well, I've got this property now, but I want to travel. I'm a digital nomad, or I'm a this, or I'm a that. I'll just rent it out. And then, is it still an ideological community when the participants are people coming to rent there or coming to, it's very hard to keep those communities together, I think. And I suppose I'm thinking, there are far more examples of communities that arise around a common goal in economic goal. We are by a river, therefore we can make money here, fishing, running mills, blah, 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 So what's the, in your line of research and understanding of governance and things like this, what's the best way to start?
Well, more or less like you described. So find an area of mutual interest. So for instance, if you're designing a currency, a community currency, right, there's no point, and people have tried it and it always goes wrong, if you just come in with the theory of the currency and you say, use it, because it's extremely difficult to do it that way. But if you find enough people who have enough interest in exchanging, and there isn't enough cash available to them to do that, but by working together they can produce produce which they can sell on the market, then you've got a good chance of starting that currency. So the real skill of designing a vibrant currency community is to find a big enough community that you can attract and sign up to the platform and know that there are productive ways that they can produce something together that they can't do just by themselves, right? Then you've got a good chance. And that's usually some sort of community, some sort of business sector where there are reasons for them to do that sort of exchange. So, for instance, with the Ukrainian diaspora or the Belarusian diaspora, you've got a huge number of startups that have been chucked out of the country for reasons of this conflict, right? And they used to be able to network in the city. They used to be able to trade. They're often working in software, so they can do it digitally and remotely. So they've got a reason to trade, right? And that will save them money. And it's difficult for them to do it because it's difficult for them to establish the bank accounts and all sorts of things. So given that sort of situation, there's an economic reason for them to cooperate, and they've also got a cultural reason to do it. So now you can start to build on that, right? And then it helps if you've got a vision, like something passionate. So the vision of rebuilding their country, of going home again and setting up the systems that are going to make that work like it's never worked before, that really helps, right? So, for instance, if you look at the history of intentional communities, the ones that tend to live longer are the religious communities because they have that very strong ideology, right? The other thing is these things, there's just literally been no design effort into these things. I mean, the amount, you talked about this kind of like what happens, let's say, when you want to sell and move. I mean, people think a little bit about that, but generally not enough. And it's not just thinking about it, like being a nerd and researching it. You've got to live it. You've got to do workshops with families. You've got to enact the potential social conflicts. You've got to imagine the sort of rules. It's like, to me, it's a piece of theatre, and you would need to do those workshops. And who you onboard to that community and how you design it, you really have to think through a whole. That's just one example. What happens when there's someone really, or a group of people come in and they try and buy up a bunch of places, and,
exactly.
And what happens when
generational? Like your kids often rebel ideologically against you.
Yeah.
Well, they're going to live there as well. They're going to grow up there.
So just workshop it, because with all these things, it is culture that solves it. It's like how you design a good school. How do you talk to your kids? Some cultures are better at it and some worse. And so then what frameworks, what incentives, what rules? And I mean, it's literally like writing War and Peace. The amount of work you have to put into imagining, and then you combine that with the threats that happen, the technologies that happen, the changing. It's a huge amount of creative. Now, for me, so I mean, often if you do a startup and you've got a bunch of kids, let's say, who've got a passion to make some money and release some technology, or you have a not-for-profit that they want to come together, you've got all that energy, but trying to get them to look at the legal side or the constitutional side, no one's got time for it, right? So they just pick something off the shelf. Usually, the incubator or whatever says this has been tried and tested. And people simply don't have usually the time and effort to do this kind of nerdy, boring governance stuff. In this case, I think the extra agreement we can do is we're going to turn that into deep fun. So crafting this science fiction, really imagining it, workshopping it, using theatre, using performance, using CGI-generated graphics, publishing that, imagining that, workshopping it with communities, is the subject matter itself is what we're going to be working on. And for that reason, because that's also very motivational, I've done those workshops with people. If you do it in the right way, a playful way, a creative way, and yet seriously thinking about the future of your kids and your grandchildren, right? And the ability not just to do it as a community workshop, something sponsored by the UN or something, but you really want to put that on the world stage as an amazing movie or an incredible game. Right? That vision, right, means that, and if you can make a business model around the financing of putting that on the world stage, right, then the governance aspect isn't just a cost that you have to get out of the way really quickly. It is the topic of the movie you're making, right? It is the heart of what you're engaging people with. And then you've got a chance of putting enough thought and enough empathy and enough creativity and enough law and enough everything into it. And I think we've got a real chance of doing that. And luckily we've got this IP as well that helps, that we can really kind of play with, and we've got some communities that are really interested in.
Just a quick question about the intellectual property you're talking about. How does that fit into it, though? I don't understand. You've got Hitchhikers.
Yeah.
But what are you talking about? That gives you a source of revenue or a source of ideas or what?
So, I mean, for instance, if that community decides to make a feature movie out of it, that's a minimum for an indie, let's say, sci-fi movie of about 15 million that we have to raise to finance that movie. That movie will make money. How will that money be distributed? Will it just go to the 43 hitchhikers? Will it go to the whole community?
No, wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm misunderstanding you, I think. What's the hitchhikers connection here? You've got like the intellectual property of hitchhikers.
Yes.
They're sort of letting you use it or play with it or whatever.
And they want to transfer it into this foundation, so
you're talking about royalty and all this kind of stuff. Is it a source of income, a source of revenue? Or
it will make creative projects.
Right, okay.
Yeah? It's like an incubator of creative projects, of startups, it'll generate code, it'll generate legal agreements, it will develop pieces of land, it will make a movie, it will make a game. These will come out of the work of the fellows. So you can think of it as a digital incubator.
So is it the family that own it? Is it Douglas Adams' family? Or?
No, the rights are a bit complicated, and I won't go into it. But the theatrical rights are actually owned by Disney, so we're not going to do a remix of the movie of Hitchhikers. But Don't Panic Limited, which is like I knew Douglas, but only briefly. I did a bit of work with him back in the 90s. But his main partner, Robbie Stamp, is the lovely guy, and he's got the rights together with his business partner in Don't Panic Limited for all the Hitchhikers characters and IP as applied to real world action. So what that means is all that theoretical world we can run in the school, we can run in the fellowship, we can run in the governance model, in how you mentor, tutor. So we can use AI, creativity, or playfulness to inform a community, a creative community, about how to design this city in Ukraine, about the script that those hitchhikers work on. So the hitchhikers are kind of like the research fellows or the teachers engaging a community, and it's a kind of playful group of nomads, digital nomads, intellectual nomads, right? It's kind of what Balaji calls dark talent, is that's who we're trying to attract. The sort of people who don't classically fit into an academic university or company structure, that will move between disciplines and incubate and start some hopefully really important and amazing projects, right? And in the first year, we want to focus on this script, this film script about a future governance, a future legal network state that we want to create, Futurestate. And we want to create the code and the law of that future state. We'd like to make a movie based on that vision of that future state, maybe a game, and how that revenue and how that financing of the revenue that's invested in the movie, invested in the game, is recycled back, because it would be owned by everyone who turns up to one of our events, every one of the research fellows, according to some constitution which we have to design. And there will be a commons element and a private for-profit element to it. How are you going to design it? That's the same challenge you have to do for a city. Right. There are businesses, there are parks. So what's in public ownership or in common ownership? What is in private ownership, right? And how does that balance? And are there new models we can experiment with there? But within this annual cycle, within, if you like, intellectual property, creative industry space, we can iterate much faster, but still with significant budgets. And so we can experiment in terms of governance, in terms of network state governance. And the first one in particular, we're focusing 100% on network state issues of governance, the crypto behind it, the law behind it, the issues of land ownership behind it, intellectual property issues. There's difference, like I said, between commons and private is at the heart of it. Identity is at the heart of it. And so we're looking for researchers in all of those areas to propose and then actually build the network state that runs the project. So that means, the right legal ownership of the IP in that project. So all the work that the fellows do, the code, the characters they develop, the film visualization, the script that they develop, that's IP.
And so you could create a film using characters from the original film, from the original book of Hitchhikers, can you? Does it? I'm grappling with this idea of what you actually have intellectual property of with regards to like.
Yeah, so we're not going to do.
I mean, I'm labouring a point here, but I really want to understand it because I'm probably going to talk to someone about this tomorrow, and I want to know what I'm talking about.
All right. Well, specifically, we're not going to reenact Hitchhiker's Guide with those characters, but we are going to build a community. And we are going to build a world, a network state that has those characters in it.
Right. So
but those characters are more like mentors, AIs, characters that advise and create a universe in which you enact real world projects. So, but for instance, the script that we're working on at the moment will probably call, but it'll be up to the fellows. Is based on the work of Glenvale and Audrey Tang, which is called Plurality. So at the moment, the working title of the governance, this future governance, is called The Plurality. And we will be doing, covering, for instance, the building of this city in Ukraine, 42. But all of that is new IP. Right? It's not revisiting, but in terms of the world that we're creating for the academy and the foundation and the community and the teachers and the mentors, I'm eating your microphone here, is that world is based on the intellectual property and the universe of Douglas Adams. Right. And so his last work, for instance, was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Future, and that's the name of the first year's research program.
I don't know enough about intellectual property, obviously. I thought it was, You
anyway. Can have specific, with Lexon, we did quite a lot of work around the licensing of artworks. So you can attach, as you can with property itself, you can have use rights in various contexts, and so with intellectual property, there are rights to use in games or database or text or books or theatrical. And we do not have the theatrical rights for Hitchhikers, and we don't want to make another movie about Hitchhikers. We could negotiate for it, but that would cost money. Disney owns that. Right? What we have is the rights to use that with the original community, which is called H2G2, and to use those rights in the school, in the academy, in the foundation, in the congresses that we have, in the interface of the software that we create, the mobile apps that community use, in the NFTs and the investable and the currency universe that is investing in these projects, right? We can create a world, we can create DAOs, which they're not entertainment, they're not theatrical, right? They are literally the interface to the network state. We can use those characters because that is all about taking real world action, and we hold those rights, but we don't release these characters in the movie. We don't release these in something we perform on in the theatre stage, or if we did, we'd have to negotiate those rights. So we can use the whole brand and the brand values in that way, which is the only thing I want to do. I want to help build this city in Ukraine, right? And I want to convene people who love that work and that attitude and those characters and say, I want to sponsor some hitchhikers. I want to be a hitchhiker. I want to research this, and I want to design the interface for that community. I want to do that as a game-based interface, right? So it's really about the spirit of that book. And yeah, it's a nuance there. But I'm not interested in, and I don't think, and it's definitely ruled out that we're going to just do like Hitchhiker, the movie part 2, right? But we do want to build a community, a network state community that uses those characters and the ethos and the way and the interface in how that works, and creates new characters, new ways, owns it itself, takes it forwards, but takes the spirit of that forwards. And we can start with the convening power of hitchhikers.
I just thought of another 42 reference. It's probably it's a really random one.
Yeah, no.
Half of 42 is 21, right?
Yeah.
It's 21 million bitcoins. I
know. Yeah. That's one. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
It's all. Yeah. It's not real. It's just 42. It's just a number. Look,
it's definitely real.
It's real, but it's I don't.
The answer to the life, universe, and everything. No, it's funny when you get into it. You can get obsessed with all this stuff. There are 4.2 billion people on this planet who have democratic voting capability at the moment. It would be great to get them all involved. If we run courses for 6 weeks, it's 42 days. It's 7 days a week for 6 weeks. How you structure the interface and how you evolve it. It's the deliberative groups, the 2 pizza team of like 5 or 6 people, how you actually make assemblies of 42 and have those conversations rich, how you federate them, how you structure them, what the interface is. All of that kind of design work. And also, if you look at the characters in the book, they represent really interesting, you've got the kind of CEO, you've got the Marvin the Manic robot, that's the AI, you've got luck and chance, the improbability drive, you've got all sorts of things that we can really play with in the way that the deliberation, the community, the governance of the fellowship works. So yeah, we'll play a lot with that. But people can come up with their own stuff as well. I mean, we don't have to stick to that. It's just a nice starting point.
Just before we go, because we're already over, but it's an interesting conversation. I like it. What, if any, can you speak about really successful governance projects that you've ever encountered? Nothing future now. What have you been involved in or observed or is happening that you think, yeah, this is a really, like I agree, the 7-year thing, the 7-year itch, it's a real thing. So come on, tell me some success stories that.
I think one of the ones I really like, interestingly, I haven't been since COVID, so I'm interested in how it survived COVID, was the Chaos Communication Congress and the community there. So every year they put on an event of about 12,000 hackers. Started off in Berlin, has been in Hamburg for a very long time. And it is run by volunteers. So they usually, even the setup, the logistics of setting up the venue for the hotel happens in between Christmas and New Year and takes over 2 months, delivering materials, truck setups. They have about 1,000 volunteers. It's every talk there. You have is translated into 20, 30 languages by volunteers. The volunteers pay for a ticket. And the tickets are usually really cheap. And they were like 80 euros. They're probably a bit more for the 4 days of the Congress. The thing is a thing of beauty. How it is run, the quality of the talks, the quality of the media. It's great. Every 4 years, they also run a great camp out in nature. They do a proper Zuzalo style village. I mean, it is the inspiration of that. So those kind of hacker camps, and CCC isn't the only one, but that is a real inspiration of how you finance, how you own, how you community organize. And that's been running a long time. And it is a community of interest, privacy respecting, hacker crypto community. It's got an edge to it, all this kind of stuff. So that would be one, for instance, I would say.
What about something? I mean, maybe they don't exist, but I can see that that's a success in the model of, pop-up things.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking more in terms of real projects on the ground, residential, people running their lives, living. I mean, I understand that the chaos communications one is a network state when it's not happening, I suppose. Is that fair to say? Is that what you mean? Like, while the Congress is not happening, it's a network state.
Yeah.
Is that part of the idea behind the network state? Then are they not as focused on places that stick around?
Like from Futurestate point of view, doing a network state for, let's say, the Belarusian or Ukrainian diaspora, it can exist completely as a network layer where people are geographically completely dispersed. From the Hitchhiker's Fellowship point of view, we can have literally embassies and we can have flats that people put into the community, that fellows and community events, that if you put them together could be substantial physical space that could actually be bought and owned, right? But they don't all have to be in the same physical location. Right. So whether they're virtual or physical, whether they're nomadic or permanent, I don't think is the be all and end all. It needs to be a long running, sustainable, intentional community, which has the capability of interacting with the real world, dealing with real issues, whether they be managing a park, building a city, or managing the Chinese diaspora or some community of science fiction writers from all around the world, or environmentalists, or programmers. You can have these communities that own land, pay each other, trade with each other, interact with each other, may create a city, may not, and that can be global scale. I mean, they can have millions of people interacting with each other, and they can own property and transfer property, assets, digital or physical, between each other.
In the same geographic area, or not even that?
In the same, or globally.
Right.
I mean, it's an open canvas. For instance, if you want a creative industry network state, you could have people, companies and firms all taking part, belonging to a kind of global trade association. They could own and buy properties together. They could create digital institutions of all sorts, to elect, make decisions, to lobby, to buy land, to create and finance residencies, create, films, whatever. These things are entirely possible to create. Now using the kind of code and legal infrastructure that is the network state. Obviously a big focus right now is can we buy an island? Can we buy a physical piece of land? And that's very interesting. It's very slow. It's very, expensive. It's very easy to get wrong. It's very interesting in terms of special economic zones. It's very important in terms of reconstructing real areas of lands in war conflict. It's very relevant, but it's a big, heavy beast to tackle. But there are other forms of community that still have the capability of legal interaction with all sorts of entities. I
was chatting to someone the other day on this podcast in Dubai, actually, about, he's a digital nomad, quite an influential one. And he said, he's kind of now got this large network of people. It's large enough to start approaching governments and saying, look, give us a good visa. and we'll come and live in your country for like 1 year or 2 years or whatever the visa is. You know, I represent, I kind of, in inverted commas, represent a large number of highly mobile, in professional people.
Well, we'd
Would
love
you
to
like
talk
us?
to him. Yeah, but I mean, that's exactly.
But that's a good. I mean, this is like another version of that thing. I've always called them online communities, but I now see the legal layer that you're talking about that kind of makes it more like a network state.
Yeah, I mean, so in terms of the Hitchhiker Foundation, the Hitchhiker Fellowship, the kind of, we want to take that vision of digital nomad to the future, right? And we want to represent digital nomads. I mean, everyone from Ukraine and these diaspora, they are digital nomads for us. Right. So we're rebranding, if you like, a hitchhiker, this kind of 1970s term, as this persona of someone who is stateless in that sense, and reimagining what the state is, right? And digital nomads is the aspirational contemporary way of that. So yeah, a global trade union of digital nomads that can negotiate with any country and obtain especially passport, banking, startup, preferential treatment, can get access to the university campuses, to the incubators and the startup accelerators. And that's why, for instance, the Cypriot government is helping us host the first Congress. It's because they're very interested both in crypto. They've also got the whole political context there of conflict with the North-South issue there that would be amazing to resolve. You know, how's the land question going to be settled? You know, how are we going to open up that question, right? But they're also super interested in attracting digital nomads. So holding and a lot of those nomads, it's detailed questions of passport, setting up the bank account, how the tax is paid. All those things are something that the network state offers a lower cost, attractable, kind of embeddable structure that enables, if you like, classic, you know, I don't know what they're called, pre-web institutions, legal institutions to interface with and say, how do I negotiate with digital nomads? How do I even work this? If you come up with a repeatable way of doing that, the contractual legal basis for doing that, then that's a really valuable service to lots of countries.
No, it is. And thanks for this conversation. I'm really getting my head around a lot of that stuff a lot better. I've not looked too hard at the network state thing because I find that I end up bogged down in word salad very, very quickly, and I have no interest in it really. Yeah. But you've explained a few things in a much more succinct way. I'm still not sold on the crypto side of it. You know, I was thinking about like what you were just saying then about sort of like a worldwide union of digital nomads, for example. And the guy I spoke to last on this podcast, who's coming out on Friday, let me just say this because it's important. He was talking. What they're doing on Nostr is creating. Well, the digital identities on Nostr is really easy, but they're basically using those identities as ways to, and they're kind of anonymous. They can be anonymous if you want them to be, to vouch for other people. And because I think the system that we're talking about here, where you get a large group of people who you can lever that group to get sort of special things in countries or whatever, they need a method to sort of be a part of that thing. And I've never got on board with the sort of crypto side of it. And by that, I mean everything except Bitcoin, because I've never thought of it as fully decentralized. Therefore, the attack vector's always there. You could bring that system down because it's co-optable. It's, you know, if it's Ethereum, you could, if you decided to arrest Vitalik, he'd probably cave and change the code for you, basically, because there are many.
Why do you care so much about that?
I care because I think at the end of the day, all of these things that we're talking about are a direct threat to the most powerful people on the planet. And I would imagine you would understand as well, based on your past, that what you're doing is subversive. It doesn't always have to be, but it's intrinsically subversive in a way. So we always end up treading on people's toes in the end. And as soon as you get big enough, that there's a knock on the door, and it's
absolutely.
It's the mafia. They're here to say this is our territory.
So the question is, what are the best tools you've got? So I mean, good cryptography is a good tool that you can use. I mean, it's literally, not quite, but literally impossible to break. That allows you to do things, like sign something.
Yeah, but you were talking, signing, I agree. But in land, and like NFTs or what, I don't know what your structure for land registration was, for example. But in other communities, I've seen them using crypto. And it's like, cool, but what's the connection with the real world there?
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's like any kind of religion you start, right? Again, the founders and the people who created the first code bases, they're smart. They're well aware of the limitations and the problem. The way that it gets taken up and tweeted about, and the kind of the second and third waves of following take the primitives, if you like, of what you can do with that in a particular skewed direction, right? And it's understandable, speculative direction, for instance. And it's like you don't need the depth you haven't needed historically to worry about legal implications and things like that. You don't need to think about the philosophy of it or the identity or even the centralization of it, apart from you want to get enough kind of social media attention and protect yourself and blag, but you could lie about that blatantly and still be successful, right? And so it's a kind of like some mass global stock offering, and you get a whole bunch of dodgy characters piling into it. And so it has a bad taste in the mouth, and it's corrupt in many ways, and it has the vulnerabilities that you're talking about. But that's the foundation of any nation state. We started off as pirates, It was dodgy as fuck to begin with, right? And at the same time, the mathematics and the tooling under that is truly revolutionary. The things you can do with crypto are amazing, and especially zero knowledge proofs and what have you. And we haven't even begun to attach on that. But that's not, like I said, enough. You also need to decentralize it legally. You can also do incredibly creative things legally that most people aren't incentivized to do. But if you want to create talked about unions, right? Unions are great, but they're medieval. I mean, again, it's like it's not sophisticated governance technology. It was invented pre-Facebook, those structures, let alone pre-crypto and what have you, right? How you would structure a participatory workplace and give representation to a workforce globally is very unlikely to use the same technologies that a union is classically legally structured for. But if you take those values and those ideas and then you redesign it, and then you think of the attack vectors and you think of this and you protect about those, you will want to use some crypto there, and you will want to use some law there, and you will want to use some storytelling and some onboarding and some human-centered design there, and you want to think about how you evolve it. You want to defend yourself martial arts wise, head, heart, hands. You want to, it's not just crypto, and it's not crypto. It's just one of the weapons you can use to build something robustly. Because whatever you say about crypto, it has been shit tested. It is really good, protective, hard to hack code, because and it's been battle tested. People have been trying to steal money off each other in crypto for a decade now, and it's not easy to do, right? And if you think about how credit cards used to work, where you would open up a phone line and read the number out to someone and someone writes it down the other side. You can build a lot of globally scalable, powerful shit with terrible crypto. But that has much more centralizing and corruption possibilities than if you have really good crypto. With really good crypto, you can start to build. You have the ability, even if you don't have a lot of money, to build and protect governance and financial, international, global institutions you want to craft that previously you would have needed an army of security guards. You didn't need to be one of the richest people on the planet to do, right? You can create things that you couldn't do before using that technology. Are people doing it? No, because there isn't a big financial incentive to do it. But there are a lot of people who do care, and that technology is now open source, and there is a lot of money that you can build sustainable models doing that. Putting those pieces together is the work that we have in front of us, and it's fun, exciting work, right? And crypto and understanding it is a huge part of that. There's no doubt about that. And just because it stinks, just because, a lot of pirates just were in it for the gold, right, doesn't mean that there isn't something in that spirit of entrepreneurship that couldn't be done in a different way or what have you and used.
I'm not alluding to the fact that there's been a lot of crypto scams over the years. I'm alluding to the fact that I think a really important aspect of the technology, the code of a network state or of any new state has to be as decentralized as possible. And because if it's not, it can be attacked by the
it will be attacked
the income. Yeah, right. Okay, but it can be defeated as well. And
but for instance, let's say you're attacked.
Yeah.
Sometimes diversity and decentralization is an important defense mechanism, but so is centralization. Right? I mean, centralization itself isn't the enemy. The centralization of power, according to the rules of that current game, can be incredibly violent and corrupting if it's centralization of something shit. But for instance, centralization and an economy based on respect and the best people with the most honorable character, are chosen to be a judge or something like that. And the fact that you only have a certain small number of judges isn't necessarily a terrible thing. And in fact, a good legal system with that form of centralization can protect against all sorts of corrupting. If you just take your body, you have centralization thing going on all over the place. And without that centralization, you're just a bunch of amoeba. You can't move. You can't defend yourself. Centralization is essential to good governance. How you centralize, how you control that centralization, how you avoid the corruption of that centralization is the secret sauce. And it is undoubtedly a case that there's been too much centralization going on as a movement financially, politically, and even biologically. Diversity in every domain is being wiped out. Right. And so it is absolutely right, this focus on decentralization, right? And protecting it and reintroducing it, rewilding our governance, our natural systems, right? But it is also completely wrong to aim for a flat, horizontal, randomized, decentralized system, right? That just won't work. If I went into your brain and decentralized it, you wouldn't be able to think, 80% of the connections of your brain goes through 20% of your neurons. There's centralization there because you have to have some architecture to organize things.
I think what I'm drilling out then is, just listening to that last thing you said, is that I'm concerned about the decentralization of truth. And by that, I mean blockchains are truth, but they're degrees of truth.
Blockchains aren't truth.
Well, take Bitcoin, for example. each block is what happened, and it's unequivocally true, because
it's what happened on the chain. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. But that's what you base with blockchains. That's what you base all of the layers or whatever around, is the fact that you know that after 3 or 4 blocks in the block, it's almost certainly to such a large degree truth, whatever happened in the past. And that's because it's decentralized. And the degree of decentralization is the degree of how true it is, if you see what I mean. And so that's what I mean. I'm not saying, I get the sense, for example, that this is how I've read what you've said. Crypto is not perfect, but it's better than this, and it's usable and it works and blah, blah, blah.
I see it like steel. If you want to make a building, it's useful to have access to steel, right? But it would be a bit weird if you built the whole building out of steel and didn't use brick or glass or wood, right? So it's a very useful building material.
True, but the basis is steel, like the blockchain is steel. Then all the other layers can be whatever you want, because the steel is true. That's what I mean.
I mean, I think it is interesting. I mean, I come from this from the perspective of science originally, and thinking about peer review and truth very much, and how that process works, which is basically taking a jury, a room full of your peers, to attest to and witness an experimental result. It's taking the legal system and then publishing it in a certain way and then recording it off chain, if you like, but in a certain way, and sharing that globally, right? That process, that's the closest iterative process we've probably had to getting towards truth, right? Blockchains take some of that, but they also screw some of that up, right? So I wouldn't say that the current blockchain architectures have a particularly, you can use them to create truthful systems. You can use them to lie with if you want, right? It would be difficult to build a global system in which, so I'm really into D-science, or what used to be we call blockchain for science, right? It would be very difficult to create a global system without blockchain, because we can use blockchain to recraft the scientific institutions to be less corrupt than they currently are, right? But it's possible to create a fascistic system out of blockchain. It's not, the Chinese government can use blockchain to do what the fuck they want, right? It's not purely in that block architecture that the good systems and truth comes out of. But we can use that architecture, and it would be very difficult to design systems currently without using that architecture that reshape the matrix, right? Because the existing shit that's out there is really crude, really unsophisticated, but it's evolved and very powerful. And if we want to try and find a design space where we can change its own self-perpetuation direction that those current beasts are going in, then the best opportunity we have is to find some spaces that are problematic with real users, and then use law and technology, and blockchain is a key technology there, to create defensible systems. But to think that the whole thing is based on a bit of math and a bit of chain logic and a protocol is interesting sci-fi, but I've always considered it naive, right? There are other ways of decentralizing things, off-chain ways of doing it. There are legal ways of doing it. There are how you choose your team, and it's really about the design of those institutions. And blockchain and law are the same thing to me, but they're deeply related, right? Ways of designing the walls of that decision-making space. But our task is to create human-centered institutions, modern-facing institutions that are better than the medieval ones that we've got. And just buying into the whole YouTube, Twitter, social media hype around selling virtual tokens and making loads of money is not going to get you into the real power of that technology and the real philosophical and and importance of, in terms of the future structures of society that we can create using those. And just because the early experiments in that space, like I talked about with the pirate metaphor, are just a bit weird and a bit chitty, doesn't even begin to dive into how that stuff's going to be used in 100 years' time.
So what's just quickly, because we could go on for ages. I've got so many questions, but we really do have to stop. Why wouldn't you, for example, then just use a normal database instead of a blockchain? Is it the decentralized aspect of it?
Well, I mean, you would want to use a centralized database for all sorts of things, right? But I mean, it is like with any institution you design, right? If you put all the gold in one bank, or you put all the identities or all the important data in one thing, it's obviously a bit stupid. I mean, what if it rains? What if there's an earthquake? What if someone steals it? It's just dumb architecture, right? It's just obviously stupid. It's cheap, it's easy, it's lazy, right? It's Web 2, right? It's a thing. And Web 2 is a bit more than that. That's to do with replication of the data and making it scalably accessible to everyone. But it is just a bad design decision, right? Now, if you're trying to change, let's say, the financial system, which is really what crypto Bitcoin was about, right? The early experiments with that in eGold, they did just shut down the server, right? So the research question is, how do I stop that? How do I stop that? In that particular domain, right, obviously having an unshuttable down ledger made a lot of design sense, right? And you might want to do that. Then it has some problems. It's like the immutability becomes a real problem because your naive original assumptions that you hoped it would be decentralized and it turns out not to be becomes a real problem. So you need to change it. But I didn't think about how to change it. And in fact, it was a design feature that I couldn't change it. Now you're screwed, right? Or right, you have to do a hard fork or what have you, right? So, those design decisions are just architectural design systems, but the ability to decentralize, whether it be your immune system or whether it be the ecology of a forest or whether it be the innovation ecosystem of your country or whether it be how you store your data, how you protect your democracy, is a very important feature, but it's just one of several important features. And it can be abused and you can worship and say it's all about decentralization. But that's stupid. Nothing is decentralized. It's like saying it's the most stupid idea, decentralization. And like in that sense, diversity is an important one.
But I mean, it is a good strategy for robustness.
Diversity is better.
To get through volatility, these are, the decentralized notion of decentralized, whether you apply it to a blockchain or to...
Name me one thing that's decentralized that way in the whole universe.
In which way? In the same way as a blockchain?
Just the idea that everything is just sort of scattered evenly in some sort of...
well, it's not necessarily evenly. I mean, like thoughts, culture is decentralized, for example, right?
It's hugely centralized.
No, but it's the thought behind culture. I choose whether or not I'm going to adopt that culture. I can be an Italian in the UK, and I can still,
but that
drink
thought
espresso.
That you had, like the espresso thought, came from a small elite of like coffee shops. Then everyone adopted that same thought, and there's a billion forms of drink, but we all drink flat whites or whatever it is. It's a centralized thing.
No, well, I would call that decentralized. I'm talking about the thought. The thought is freely...
Memes, as they float around, they obey the power law of 80-20, that sort of thing. They all centralize in that. And some people become extremely powerful within the Twitter sphere of memes, of culture, right? In gossip, it tends towards centralization, even though you might try and start with it all decentralized and equally scattered. But it's centralizes.
That doesn't mean that they're not centralized. It means they tend towards centralization, which is, I agree with, the Pareto distribution, all those kind of theories. It's true. We know that. But I think the life is a play. One of the main sort of like pendulums in life is centralized and decentralized. And it's a dance, isn't it? It's the yin and one of the yins and yangs that we have to deal with. It's what we're all trying to find a good equilibrium for. But there's no such thing as a good equilibrium.
Well, put it this way, another thing. I mean, I kind of agree, but it just, to me, it's always sounded naive and wrong. Not because it's wrong, but just because it's not rich enough of a concept. Like, for instance, decentralization could be the same thing scattered everywhere, right? You know, the same token, or the same algorithm, the same thing, right? And that is just not that interesting when you're talking about culture or anything. What you want is a diversity of things scattered everywhere. That's what you really want. You want a diversity of culture. You want a diversity of thinking. You want a diversity of institutions. You want a diversity of approaches, not the same thing scattered everywhere. If you just took some homogeneous law and scattered it everywhere and decentralized it, it's not going to help you very much.
Yeah, but I think, see, in my world, what you're describing, the diversity is of decentralized things.
Decentralization is an aspect of diversity. You couldn't get the diversity without it being also decentralized. But for some reason, the word, you can understand it because it's a computer term about data structures that kind of captured the difference between a centralized database and a decentralized
Which is
database.
super important. I mean, I think I've learned a lot through studying, especially computer
not as
science.
important as a diversity of those databases.
True.
For instance, if you have,
that's a secondary order.
You're
factor,
talking about the attack vectors. When you have a decentralized unanimity, right? You have one thing that you can attack. When you have a diversity of chains or a diversity of consensus mechanisms or a diversity of legal organizations that control the servers or then it becomes, and they're all decentralized, then it becomes truly hard to attack. Without the diversity, it's not hard to attack.
Well, let me think
it's quite
about that.
hard.
It's very hard and certainly hasn't been provenly attacked talking about Bitcoin here, obviously, since for a very long time, that has actually worked in the way. There may be social layer attacks, happening right now, people trying to change the code by inserting themselves in certain communities but as far as, I think what it is with me is what I like about Bitcoin is that it's very chaotic. It's when I think about decentralized systems, I look at that and I think, here's the complete chaos. No one's forcing you to join or not join the network. No, whatever you want to do with it, you can do with it. The barriers to entry are very low, blah, blah, blah. And it is the biggest honeypot on the planet as well. So, and it's proving extreme robustness, more than anything we've ever known. And I like that fact because I like basing something, and this probably comes down to my personality, why I sort of veer onto that side of the kind of the network state spectrum. I'm a builder of real things, I think, rather than a thinker of necessarily philosophizing about how we build. I'm interested in actually building with my hands, So I like Bitcoin for that reason, because it gives me a truth that is very robust. It's really something very robust that I can count on. And if I was basing a layer on top of that, I'd feel very good about that. Whereas I suppose with a lot of cryptos, or all the cryptos I've ever looked into, I see the base as a little
devil's advocate.
Go on.
Well, what can you do with Bitcoin that you can't do with cash?
You can't burn Bitcoin.
But that sounds very philosophical to me.
No, it doesn't. I can burn a note here right now. Like, give me a $5 and I'll burn it. And now you've lost that $5. It's a bearer instrument. You just gave it to me and now I've got it. Bitcoin's the same, but I can't burn it with a match. It's a new form of cash, amongst other things, for sure. Like
gold.
Gold, yeah. What can I do with Bitcoin? I can transport it.
Gold is
I
cash.
can transport gold. I can't transport gold across the world without buying an aeroplane and a security team, but I can, if there's enough of it, but I can transmit Bitcoin.
It's actually quite, most of what you want to do in the real world with Bitcoin, you can do with cash. The real reason behind why it's interesting is a political thing.
Cash is confiscatable, obviously.
It's a political thing.
And it's issued, cash is issued by someone.
It's not a practical thing, it's a political thing.
Yeah, it's a token. Cash is a real token issued by a centralized authority.
But you're excited. What I'm saying is you're excited by the politics of it, not the practicality of it. If you're saying I'm a builder, it's much easier to build with cash than it is with Bitcoin.
Not at the moment, no. Not in the world I revolve in.
Well, even payments.
For payments, yeah. Well, I mean, you start somewhere. Like, the difference between crypto and Bitcoin is crypto moves much faster. It's not a slow ticking clock. It's more of a kind of move fast and break things space. But that's a quality of Bitcoin that's important, and it's a quality of crypto that's important, because the move fast and break things people are different.
Well, from my point of view, like I'm just playing devil's advocate here. I'm a big fan, but I like the early crypto days where I could be a miner. And I like the ability to play and change the code, right? I like the ability to fork and do creative things with this. Right now, I really don't have the ability to do that.
Absolutely correct.
Right?
But that's a feature of it.
Well,
not a bug.
I mean, yes, it's got that steel-like property, and you can build really cool shit with it because of that. But I find the design space within that not so interesting as what you can do with institutions, with law, with smart contracts, and basically Bitcoin is built out of a smart contract. That's what makes it. The real primitive here is cryptography, the mathematics of it, and the language, the code, the law, right? And out of that, you can create Bitcoin and you can create other things, right? But Bitcoin is a fucking phenomenally interesting and successful version of gold. Gold bores me. You can't create something new with something as old as that. Gold is just, it's nothing different. Like, armies have always been paid with gold and coins, and pirates have always used gold and coins, and it's historically invaluable. And if you don't like the current financial system and you want to go back to what pirates were using, go back to gold, right? But if you really want to change the nature of social collaboration, of democracy, of the framing of property ownership, of how education works, of how parliaments work, going back to gold is not going to solve anything.
Except, we're not talking about going back to gold.
Except it's useful to build stuff with.
But if you're interested in governance, right, which you are, and so am I, I would say that Bitcoin is the most important aspect of governance, because it defunds states that aren't productive. If the medium of exchange, for example, becomes Bitcoin, and you're a government, you can no longer print your own token and go and invade Iraq, or you can't print your own token and you can't make all these decisions from an armchair anymore. You actually have to go out and either earn it or steal it or mine it if it's still being mined. So, and I know governments steal a lot of stuff, but it's quite hard to steal compared to gold, for example. So you've got to earn it. And that actually makes governments more competitive, I think. And I'm thinking 200-year time frame here, whatever, more probably. But I do think like that. And I think, that is why I believe that at the moment, sure, there are certain things you probably can't do with Bitcoin that you can do with crypto. We know that. But I would imagine, I think the time horizon for Bitcoin is much longer than the time horizon for in the crypto space. That's been my experience anyway.
I'm not a huge fan, but never have been, I must admit. I love the technology, but for me, the economics of gold as a financial instrument are just retro. I mean, they're super, super naive, basic stuff. Money doesn't work like gold. Money isn't gold, right?
Why not?
Because money is much more like the blood that runs around your body. It depends how fit you are. It depends what your diet is. You've got to keep the pressure right. Sometimes you need more. Sometimes you need less. It depends how old you are. It depends if your brain is growing. It is the fluid that flows around your body. It's not a rigid resource like gold is, right? You can't manage biological systems with gold, right? And the economy is an evolving, growing thing. And if you want to consciously manage the evolution of that community, you're on a loser if you're using. Okay, there's some places you need that in. There's some places, but in the overall economy of energy, it is a very small part of what you want to do. And that there are reasons people moved off the gold system, right? Especially when you move into intellectual property and ideas and more fluid things and what's the economic word? The non-rivalrous goods of creative economy, right? When you're moving into that space, right? When you're not and when you're having to deal with complexities of all sorts of fixed environmental resource constraints, you need a better design tool than just the amount of gold that's stuck in some mountain, which is ridiculous.
Well, yeah, I know, but I mean,
it's absurd.
Gold is used as, I mean, money has characteristics, doesn't it? It needs to have certain characteristics.
Used to in medieval times, but that is just tiddlywinks invented 2,000 years ago. In the future, we will not be using money.
You don't think so? How will we express value then?
We will have flows of value which are incredibly sophisticated with interfaces that are certainly not spreadsheets and don't use numbers. It'll be unrecognizable, the different flows of value that and how they interoperate with each other. With money is simply, it's pre-medieval institution developed based on the technologies that were available then, that has that path dependency of power, which means it's very hard to get out of that game and do something better, right? And whether you go back to gold or any of these historical things, it's interesting but it's so crude.
I'm not advocating going back to gold, but I am saying.
Well, what's the difference between Bitcoin and gold? It's a
Bitcoin
finite
is internet
supply.
Native. Yeah, but Bitcoin's internet native.
Yeah,
so
but it's an internet version of gold.
It's like being able to send gold, and it's programmable as well.
Yeah, but it's the essence of a finite supply that's the problem.
Why?
Because, like I said, life isn't finite.
Yeah, but
your blood supply is not finite.
Yeah, I know, but you can. Bitcoin is finite in one sense, but it's divisible in another sense.
Yeah, so what if you have, I don't know, 1/10 of the population or 1,000 times the population? What are you going to do? What if demand? When your body changes volume, shape exponentially, when you move to other planets and things like that, the idea that just historically, computer science rife with, fixing the date on 1972 or when it was, or some equally stupid decision, right? You need to be able to evolve your energy flow counting mechanism with the evolution of culture. Having it as a fixed, finite resource, whether it be gold or Bitcoin, is just dumb if you're talking over a 10,000-year history.
Except, well, maybe we're not talking over a 10,000-year history.
Or even 100 years.
But why would Bitcoin be finite in that sense? I don't know.
Because there's a finite number of tokens. It's built into the mass.
You can divide it indefinitely.
Oh,
that's like the pizza thing, isn't it? It's like, I've got 10 slices of pizza. Okay, wait, no, but I've just cut it. I've cut another one in half. Now everyone's got more pizza. No, we've got the same amount of pizza. We've just divided it.
Yeah, I mean, technically you would have to, and you can put markets on markets and do all sorts of things.
It's important. Like, there's no shortage of Bitcoin because it's divisible up to the moment 100 million, and it's very easy to divide it into microsats if you really want to. So it's not a problem. The problem with it being,
the problem is you want to be able to increase and decrease the money supply. That's what you want to be able to do as a design feature.
Yeah, I disagree with that.
Because if you don't, you get all sorts of and it's like I said, you want to be able to regulate your blood pressure. Right? You want to be able to increase the volume of blood or decrease it depending on what's going on. If you don't, you get hypertension, you get all sorts of problems.
Yeah, but that,
right? You get speculation.
But once again, we're talking about gambling. Bitcoin is blood. It's not the amount of blood. Bitcoin would be the blood in that analogy. The amount of blood Bitcoin's infinitely divisible, so it doesn't really matter. It can absorb whatever you want.
Yeah. I mean,
I think the problem that you may have alluded to then with the interplanetary one, 10,000 years, is a problem of transmitting, like Bitcoin. It's important that the whole world syncs up time-wise with Bitcoin. And if you live on a planet 10,000 light years away, you wouldn't be able to spend the same money. You'd have to create another blockchain over there. But anyway, that's a whole different...
I mean, I come from a different economic perspective completely, and I find it childish to base money on something as simple as gold, right? I really think it served a historical need at a certain period of time. But what you often find in the growth of a society, you know, with the cycles that you get is that at some time you need to put more money into circulation, and sometimes you need to take it out of circulation. And you need to manage that quite consciously, just like your body does with blood pressure. Sometimes you need more, sometimes you need less. If you try and go with just a completely rigid mathematical algorithm or a fixed set of resources, and you try and marry that to an evolving, growing, changing, booming, busting organic system, you just can never do it. And this divisibility argument is interesting. I haven't come across it before, but it's wrong. I mean, it's more that when you have that fixed supply and you can't change it, you get different pressures, which is revolved in the speculative value of that asset. Right. And so you get ridiculous human incentivized behavior of gambling on the predicted future, and because it's too rigid, and therefore if you can smooth it out and govern that smoothing out and use it it's a speculative asset like gold is, rather than a means of exchange which is you can regulate in a way in which it's not worth speculating on. Right?
Well, as a medium of exchange, currently, obviously, it's going through a monetization process that may last 100 years. We don't really know. And I agree, it's hard for it to be a medium of exchange at the moment.
Well, that's all I'm saying. All I'm saying is its function economically is useful and it's great and important. But the idea that it's the foundation of all economic value transaction, right? And that its properties as a non-government manipulable supply of digital gold is all we need, and everything will be stable and great from that point of view. It just makes no biological sense to me.
I don't think people think it's going to make things stable. I think it's going to make things truthful. There'll be a lot of volatility under a Bitcoin standard, but you won't see large banks, for example, get bailed out when they fail. You'll see banks fail and be bought at a proper market price, and then someone else coming in and actually running them so that they don't fail. When you talked about the incentive model, the incentive model under Bitcoin is phenomenal. Especially even now, it incentivizes long-term thinking, which I think is one of the main solutions to a lot of the problems we see on the planet at the moment. Is that we live in the world of short-term thinking. And I know, and not just because I'm a Bitcoiner myself, but I've seen even people very close to me transformed by interacting with it, in as much as they were kind of YOLO, let's go people. And 5 years after interacting with the Bitcoin blockchain, buying some, saving some, they're now thinking very long term and thinking about solutions for things way in the future that they never would have done, because it does actually incentivize that. And
I've seen the opposite.
Maybe 10 years ago.
I had flatmate. I had quite a few, I've been in that space, and it's a bit like seeing people get addicted to a video game, and literally their psychological mood and depression or energy levels and their sleep cycles starts to fluctuate according to the Bitcoin price.
Sure.
And they're addicted to the trading screen, and they become incredibly short-term because of that.
Yeah, that's trading. I mean, you can trade anything.
I agree the philosophy, but whether that philosophy is even true with regard to the long-term position of Bitcoin in the market. And I agree that the thinking about the design of Bitcoin was long term. And I again, as a politics rather than a reality, right, of how it affects real people in society. The way I've seen it affect real people in society is it turns peace-loving hippies into Wall Street traders who are incredibly nervous and run around like which is kind of good if you want people to run around. I'd say they weren't
real hippies then. That's a hard change. That's a hard fork. That is very difficult.
But
anyway, look.
In terms of philosophy and in terms of a design building block, which is essential, gold is very useful. Right? And digital gold is very useful. But it really has quite negative consequences socially.
Not that I have not seen that. But anyway, we'll have
Classically, it's the way of funding wars and armies.
Yeah, but listen, look, think about this, right? Currently, if you want to fund a war and you're the US government, you just quick phone call to the Federal Reserve, let's have a war. Go back to a gold standard, and I'm not a gold bug in any shape or form, but use the example of a gold standard. Under a gold standard, how did you fund a war? You had to issue war bonds. You had to get people, the government had to get real people to buy their war bonds, right? And then you got some money. And that's...
But you go and steal it off the Spanish.
Right.
And you kill lots of Indians.
But the point is, the theory is good. You know, the fact of the matter was, there's a very famous example, and I can't remember which era it was, but the Bank of England bought their own war bonds at one point to convince the public that they were very much into fighting a war. So, which is the problem of that system. That's a centralized system. Even when people are issuing war bonds, you know, the bank can print a load of new money and buy them back. You can't print a load of new Bitcoin. If you're really dealing with the actual chain, which is where it comes back to the truth of the chain, you as a government, you can either beg, borrow or steal or actually add value and earn it. And I honestly do believe
but
that...
How are you proposing to stop people issuing bonds?
Tokens.
Even if you have universal Bitcoin everywhere, people will still be able to issue bonds.
True. But
or bonds.
True, but...
So how does it help?
It helps because the bond under a Bitcoin standard would have to be a Bitcoin.
But you don't have to. That's what I mean. You can't stop people using other forms of money.
You can't. But the good thing about Bitcoin is, unlike gold, again, is anyone at home can verify whether a Bitcoin is real or paper, like a bond. They can actually decide. And
which you can do with gold, yeah.
Well, yeah, not very easily. You have to get a machine and you have to roll the gold out and everything. It's a complete nightmare. And most people don't realise it. A lot of people buy gold.
Okay, it's a
anyway,
more impressive form of gold.
But anyway, it does make printing money by a government harder, and actually at some point impossible. Providing
gangsters love gold.
I don't care.
I'm just saying I don't think moving over to gold decreases violence. I do think...
Yeah, but we're not talking about moving over to gold.
We're talking about...
moving over to Bitcoin.
The same thing.
Well, it's not.
Same philosophy.
But gold is held in a centralised bank vault and it's never moved anywhere. It's all paper. All
I'm saying is people behave the same when they trade in and use Bitcoin as if they use bling and gold coins, right? And it's pirate currency. And it's speculative, and it's the sort of thing.
El Salvador?
No.
People the pupusa lady's using it on the beach to receive money from me as a tourist, instantly by phone. It's digital native, decentralized money, and that is really at the moment the most important thing about it.
Yeah.
And there's a whole conversation to be had there about second layers and about people transmitting fiat currencies over the Bitcoin network and everything. But, my sort of theory is that the base layer of culture is value transfer. And if your value
value?
Well, the value of the individual participants in culture.
But there are hundreds of types of value.
Sure.
Respect?
Yeah. You can show your respects to people.
How much is your grandmother worth?
Good question. I don't know.
There are different values. That's all I'm saying. And gold is a particular type of value. The way that people play with gold is the value that people it emerges and it accelerates in people playing with gold is very different from other games that people play, like other tokens, right? So gold, whether it be Bitcoin or whether it be real gold, incentivize a certain type of behavior that humans play. If you see them playing historically or in the present, how they behave, how fast they move, how angry they get, how competitive they get, and so forth. The game that people play with a currency, a token, cash, gold, is very different from other games that people play. In game design, you have many different forms of token that you can earn in different ways, and it's very important that you can't trade one for another. And while the financial system is problematic, right, in many ways, right, mainly I think it's problematic because of the way that it is issued and the way that certain aspects of the economy are not valued, right? But whether you use gold or not, or whatever current retro financial theory you use in that thing, it's not addressing the fundamental problems of the economy. And the fundamental problems of the economy is it doesn't value your grandmother, it doesn't value nursing, it doesn't value the environment, it doesn't value a whole sorts of things, and it incentivizes a lot of shitty human behavior. So the present economy is an amazingly successful and powerful game which incentivizes people digging shit out of the ground and making stuff, right? But it doesn't do all those other good things, right? And in fact, it destroys a lot of all those other good things, right? Now, while there are problems with the economy, the real problems that I said is I would definitely like the sorts of values of community healthcare, like I said, my grandmother, to be have a higher value, right? Rather than banking, law, and these things. And I don't think that changing to a Bitcoin standard is going to change that incentive structure. I don't think it's going to touch it.
Okay, so how would you get people to value grandmothers more?
Well, there are some experiments in it, right? So for instance, there's a project in Japan where they called it caring loving tokens, right? Which was basically a time bank, right? And a time bank is your hour is worth the same as my hour. And they issued a digital currency because the problem of mobility in Japan is you used to look after your grandparents and you used to go and pick up the shopping and deliver it. But with increased job mobility, people in Osaka would go and work in, let's say, I don't know, a bank or a company in Tokyo, and they couldn't look after their grandmother. So what they would do is they would issue their tokens, which they would earn by looking after someone else's grandmother or helping some community project in Tokyo, send it to some kid in Osaka who would then pick up the shopping for their grandmother. Right? Now, the way people played with these tokens, and it was just a video game after all, right, had a completely different feel to speculative cash and profit-making incentives of gold or cash, right? I'm not saying that was a perfect system or a great system, but it certainly had a different feel to it, and it had a different emergent property. And if you look at how those sorts of games work in the real world, you can get a little hint about what you could do. If you look at online games, right, there are all sorts of things, you can talk, if you're talking Web3, soul-bound tokens, how you earn honor or reputational skills that are non-tradable in a way, or how you can have reputation fields that are based on what you've learned or what you know and your real-world experience. Again, all those value flows, right, give you an idea of how you can design markets, in other words, fluid mechanisms that can evolve, right, which aren't just cash. Because cash is liquid desire, right? It's good at porn, it's good at digging shit out of the ground, it's good at bling, it's good at innovation, making cars and aeroplanes and computers and all sorts of things. And it's good at making you feel really energized and powerful and successful, right? But like I said, it's not good at valuing your grandmother.
I would still disagree with you, unfortunately.
So how much is your grandmother worth?
Well, to me, my grandmother, I never had a grandmother, funnily enough. Let's pick something else. But if I had a grandmother, she was already dead before I was born. I value her very highly, obviously. So when
You say that, but you don't put money on it.
Well, I would, because if my grandmother was alive, like with my mother, I would buy her a house if I could afford it, or I would do this, or I would do that.
You're very strange. If you look across all societies, they're impoverished.
Across societies? No.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe Western societies.
Well,
but
just take nursing then. How are you going to get nurses paid as much as bankers? Do you want them to?
I would want a free market in jobs. So I would want jobs to be priced correctly based on what all the participants in the market want. And the only way you can do that is with a neutral currency. You can't do that with a state-issued currency, because
a free market incentivizes you to play within the rules of that game to get more of those tokens. But the nature of that game will never price nursing.
Why?
Because if you're
it's
closer,
nursing now in a way.
Because you can make more money out of also by being close to the money source, by being close to the sources of power.
Yeah, but not under a Bitcoin standard.
It won't help. It won't change your ability. For instance, if you're a mathematically minded person who understands the trends and you have more access to data because you can buy that data, if you're basically in the financial Bitcoin things, you will make more speculative value out of that, and there's no way that value is going to get transferred to the nurse.
Well, the nurse will earn Bitcoin, obviously.
Pennies. You will make millions by creating a new derivative, speculative, smart contract that, like, you'll still have the financial and the legal elite making all the money.
Maybe, but you could argue that under the current system, the financial and political elite,
I agree,
are only there because they're close to the money source, right?
And it's the same.
Not under Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't have a money source. Bitcoin is issued by the miners. Is issued by the blockchain. It's not issued by a particular governmental agency or Federal Reserve or anything. So they can't just wake up one morning and say, right, we want more Bitcoin. We want to use our money printer to affect the economy, to affect culture, to affect everything.
Well, as you know from the history of Bitcoin, the politics around mining and consensus algorithms and hard forks is hardly democratic.
Well, it's open. It's open to anyone.
But you could say that between like European and American financial banking system. You've got so many big, powerful players. They all negotiate. They're trying to make as much money out of their particular mining industry, which is the banking industry. And they have a huge say in setting the regulations.
True, but they don't. On the Bitcoin network, you have no say in setting the regulations other than if you decide to basically put your case to a large group of consensus and they agree on it. It's different to a bank being able to change the rules just like that to favour themselves. That's
no, banks also have to convince all the other fucking bankers.
Not the Federal Reserve, though, or not the International Bank of Inset or whatever it is. I don't know. I mean, look, yeah. I think
this. I don't see I see an improvement in but a slightly minor improvement in the politics associated with both networks, right? I like it for all sorts of other reasons. I like it because it's open source. I like it because it's opened up a whole world of possibilities and imagination of society about what's possible. But for me, it's still medieval shit. It really is, right? What you can do with the future of finance and addressing real fucking problems is amazing. And I do not think that just tinkering with the old rules of the nuances of, fungibility of savings based and speculative currencies is anywhere near as interesting as you can do with asset classes that you can create around property ownership, the ways that you can value and change the governance of natural reserves and resources, all the sorts of things you can do there can transform finance.
Maybe.
You can release, for instance, if you're talking about unions, you could release a currency which has built-in shares, so that everyone's paid with shares of the overall growth of the economy or something, right? You can do all sorts of weird things, right? And just tinkering with something to reinvent gold is useful. It's great. And it's the basis in which all the the other revolutions is based on. But the economics behind it is not the future.
It feels like when you talk about Bitcoin, you're just stopping at the base layer and you're not taking into account that the base layer it's like the base of a pyramid. It's very important that it's wide, strong, and the largest part, the most secure part.
And I'm saying that is important, but I'm interested in all those, what we can in the present build this year in terms of really scalable value systems and things which allow us to build cities, improve our democracies, improve the issues of how different professions get paid, improve the innovation landscape, and while having a classic form of economic token in the mix there is essential, right? And while it barely touches on the real governance issues that are really driving things, right? The way that leaders are elected, the way that expertise and knowledge comes in, the way that our governance and governance determines the financial institutions that we have. It's not the other way around. You don't solve governance by just creating a token.
One of the things I feel a bit unsure about when you say that, how do you value your grandmother better, is who is deciding that your grandmother has value and why, and how are you implementing that?
Everyone else asks the questions. It's for you to answer.
True.
But you don't do it with cash.
In a free market,
is the thing. You don't do it with cash.
But in a free market.
No, that's saying you do it with cash.
In
a free market, we know how to do it.
You're saying in a free market, and I mean here a pure free market, say, the market would show you how much grandma should be valued.
No, because it's a way of counting things, not soul.
No, it's not.
It isn't.
If people started buying... Basically, if grandmas were happy they were living in nice houses bought by their children,
there's a reason World of Warcraft doesn't let you buy reputation with gold, right? There's a reason there's not just one coin to rule them all. The global value system of your grandmother, religion, ethics, and everything.
But the coin doesn't.
Money doesn't value. Cash doesn't value all human values. It's stuffed. It's to do with stuff. It's not to do with these other values.
It's not, though. Look, here's an example.
You can
go back to the grandma example.
You can use it.
If we go to Japan and we see happy grandmas, which you do see a lot of happy grandmas in Japan, they have a culture which still idolizes age and people live multi-generationally, et cetera, et cetera. And in that place, people are showing the value of their grandmothers by doing up their bedrooms and creating rooms for them and buying them houses and giving them places to work out in the street. Those funny things that you see in China and Japan and Asia. And that's the market expressing value for grandmothers, not like this grandmother is worth $1 million or this one's worth $20,000. It's the expression of people in the market by how they express their value, what they spend their money on, how they exchange, what they give for that and this,
And I would say that that's absolutely true in detail, what you said, every part of that story, but it misses the point. Because let's say you go into Japan, right, and you see that in Japan, they have like the latest IKEA furniture in the grandmother's room, and they have a color television, and she has a GDP per capita of X. And you go to Jamaica, and you see the grandmother, and she's living in a straw hut, or she's living on the beach in a lovely but very cheap apartment. And you ask, in which culture is the grandmother valued more, and you're just doing it by the economic metric that you're talking about the GDP and the amount of goods bought for that person, you might say, actually, I can tell there's some hints there that if you buy more flowers in one culture for your grandmother than another, that culture, but it's such a irrelevantly crude metric, right? What you really want to do is talk to people. You want to find, like, how much time do you spend with them? What stories do you have about that? How much, if you value, you have a conversation, if you really want to find out how much a grandmother is valued in a culture. Using cash to value your grandmother is stupid metrics.
Yeah, but we're not.
No, you're saying...
I'm valuing her based on whether she's got a smile on her face or not.
Yeah, but that can't be done with cash. It can't be done with any simple token based on an economic valuation.
Yeah, but you were talking about creating I agree with what you're saying, but you were talking about creating a token that incentivizes good behavior to grandmothers.
And it's got a problem. Anytime you tokenize something, like going back to the kind of squatting days, right? You know, in Bonington Square in Brixton, there was a guy there who was extremely useful, right? He was a carpenter. He had loads of tools, right? And it was just really weird. There was something wrong, and no one could describe what was going wrong. And then a friend of a friend said, yeah, the problem is he's a counter, right? What he would do is every time he'd lend you a saw or something, 2 years later he'd come back and said, oh, no, I'm not doing it again because of this, and that. And you can understand why he did that, because he was constantly being pestered for this, that, and the other. But literally he was measuring every human interaction, memorizing it, and he had a ledger. Right. And tokenizing of all these things isn't good game design. There are some things that you want to assess without your spreadsheet, right? Like a whole bunch of human things, right? And so if you do tokenize it, the science, the sociology of it has evidence that you boost the amount of activity, the amount of energy going in there. So, for instance, if you do tokenize and you start to financialize, let's say, the care of older population, even by introducing these community currencies, you might get 2 or 3 times the amount of work put into that activity. But then people start treating it as a spreadsheet. The emotional context, the human-to-human context becomes more of a job and a game that you speculate on, and you lose some of the essential quality of love, respect, and other things that are engaged in that, right? So it's a funny balance, and it's something that when you're designing incentive systems, you've got to be very careful about. That's why in game design, there are some things that you attach an economy to and other things you absolutely don't. Because if you do attach an economy to everything in a game, it becomes quite a boring game and people start leaving. Right? So you want to have a richer set of sort of conflicting incentives, some of them which are kind of classic market, and you're saying, oh, what's my bank account? What's this? What's the value of this? And you can do your maths and your speculation on it. And some of it, you want a little bit of kind of magic and a little bit of the conversational side, which is closer to by the way, the law side. You can express in law, in language, value systems, which are far richer than you can in tokens. And that's why I'm a big advocate of the legal frameworks, the smart contract frameworks, the language, and the human-centered interaction around governance. And tokens are important, but if you apply tokens too much to the overall governance of it, you get a really ugly system.
We very much agree on that. I'm absolutely not in favour of tokenizing everything, for sure. But I do think we need a non-governmental medium of exchange. Anyway, look.
Governments are fucked up. I agree with that totally.
We've got to stop. I can see people going backwards and forwards outside waiting to get in. We've done more than 3 hours. That was supposed to be a lot less than that. But anyway, look. Maybe we can continue this conversation because it's very interesting. And I like your perspective on these things because I live very much in a kind of bubble. With regards to a lot of things, so thanks for that, and thanks for a really interesting conversation.
It's been a pleasure coming here, and let's do it again sometime.